Good morning and welcome this morning to our guests who've come here for the March meeting of the London Assembly Environment Committee. My name is Leonie Cooper and I will be chairing the meeting this morning, which is going to be looking initially at a number of regular items and then moving on to hearing from our guests initially on tube noise, and then we'll be talking about Heathrow. I'd just like to start with our first item, which is apologies for absence, and we've received apologies from Assembly Member Nicky Gavron, and I'd like to welcome Assembly Member Andrew Dismore, who is here in place of Assembly Member Gavron, and I also now understand that Sean Bailey can't join us this morning. Assembly Member Bailey's not here either today. So if we can move on to the Declaration of Interests, which is listed in pages 1 to 4 in our agenda. Can I just see if the committee are minded to accept the list of offices as set out in the papers? Is that acceptable? Good. Moving on to item 3, which is the minutes of our last meeting in February. And you'll find that on pages 5 to 42. Can I just see if you're happy to confirm those minutes as a correct record of the meeting? Confirmed. Thank you very much. Moving on to the summary list of actions, which starts on page 43 and runs on to page 48. This lists items that are still outstanding from previous meetings, things that we're pursuing. Can those be noted in terms of both completed actions and outstanding? Noted. Yes. Thank you. And that brings us rather rapidly to our first item, for which most of our guests are attending, which is the item on tube noise. Now, this has been a subject of much correspondence from those afflicted by the problem, and we're very fortunate to have a number of people with us this morning who are going to be able to speak to how it has been impacting on them and their neighbourhood and their neighbours. And we're also very fortunate to have some guests from Transport for London who are hopefully going to be able to explain some of the ins and outs of the solutions and how quickly they may or may not be applied. So just to introduce our guests, we have Richard Collins. You're very welcome. He is from the Barbican Association, who have a working group on underground issues. We have Ian Kitson, who is a resident in Marylebone. You're very welcome as well. We have Liz Lawson, who's from the Archway Tube Noise Action Group. We have Rosanna Yusuf, who is a resident in Mornington Crescent. And we also have with us from Transport for London, Helen Woolston and Duncan Weir. You're all very welcome, and we're very grateful for you joining us today to discuss these. The impacts, I think we're going to start with. Now, I've probably asked if our guests who are affected by tube noise to start by doing something possibly almost impossible. We have an hour and a half for the whole of this item. We do want to hear from TfL about the solutions, but I would like to start with some initial comments from yourselves on the impact of the noise. But because there are quite a few of you, if you can constrain your remarks in terms of timing so that we don't hear from each of you for 20 minutes, because obviously that would then take up probably more than the time that we have. So if I could start with you, Richard, I wonder if you could go into that. Obviously, you've got a working group in the Barbican Association. If you could talk about personal but perhaps wider impact as well.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm Richard Collins, as you've accurately introduced me, and I represent here the Barbican Association, which is the recognised residents' association for the 4,000 or so people who live on the Barbican estate. Now, the committee will have received an abundance of evidence showing that tube noise is a concern across London, but I'll talk specifically about my personal experience and that of neighbours on the Barbican estate. Barbican is actually built over London Underground subsurface lines running between Barbican and Moorgate stations. And the tunnel box through which the subsurface lines run is a structural part of the estate, and unfortunately it's a very efficient machine for transmitting noise and vibration from the trains to people's homes. Now, this noise nuisance has increased significantly in recent years. The new trains that are running on the subsurface lines run faster. As ridership has increased on TfL's lines, the trains are heavier and generate more noise. And of course, the track is constantly deteriorating under these pressures. So all of this has increased the noise and vibration pollution that Barbican residents are experiencing. Now, London Underground's own measurements in some Barbican homes have shown that the noise levels experienced inside homes reaches as much as 52 decibels. Now, this is for a single train, and TfL's measurements, for their own valid operational reasons, discount the levels that are achieved when two trains pass each other simultaneously. But of course, that noise nuisance is experienced by people in their homes, and so 52 decibels probably underestimates the level of noise in some Barbican homes. Now, this is, a particularly significant problem, and a measure of it is that the World Health Organization's night noise guidelines state, and I quote verbatim, adverse health effects are observed at noise levels exceeding 40 decibels. Well, we've already got 52 decibels from TfL's measurements. It doesn't take account of the increase when two trains pass each other, and the WHO guidelines refer to the noise outside homes, so 52 decibels inside a home is likely to be considerably in excess when measured outside. Consequence of these levels of noise, and again I quote from the WHO, adverse health effects occur frequently. A sizable proportion of the population is highly annoyed and sleep disturbed. So sleep disturbance is actually quite pervasive among my neighbours, and you'll not be surprised to learn that a sizable proportion of Barbican residents are indeed highly annoyed, as the WHO anticipates they would be. Now, as Assembly members will probably know, the decibel scale is a logarithmic scale. So an increase of 3 decibels approximates to a doubling of volume. A 10 decibel increase amounts to a 10-fold increase in nuisance. So again, I refer to the 52 dB that have been measured by London Underground inside a Barbican home, which is more than 10 times the 40 decibel threshold that the WHO identifies as likely to lead to health problems, sleep impairment, and so on. Now, the good news is, of course, that this nuisance can be substantially reduced. New tracks to best practice specification does reduce these noise and vibration levels substantially. But what London Underground have characteristically offered to people who have the problem that my neighbours have is track grinding, which is a palliative, is worth having, but it reduces noise levels by about 3 decibels, so it doesn't address this substantial problem. So for the Barbican, what's needed is new track throughout the tunnel between Barbican and Moorgate stations. This should be to best practice with Pandrol Vanguard clips, for the expert among us, continuously welded rail, and so on. And also there's a crossover, or to lay people, a set of points at the western end of Moorgate Station, which lies directly underneath St Barbican homes. And this is a major source of noise pollution. Now, London Underground have known about this for more than 20 years. Nothing has been done about it. So, and I'm coming to a close now, Chair. We believe that London Underground lines should have a policy of prioritising track replacement and upgrading where noise pollution exceeds WHO norms. First, this should be done where the nuisance is worst, and if anywhere else in London experiences noise levels exceeding 52 decibels, they have my profound sympathy and my recognition that they should take priority. And this kind of track replacement policy would conform to the GLA's most recent noise strategy statement, which, and again I quote verbatim, mandates TfL to minimise noise and vibration, take account of resident complaints and bring infrastructure up to best modern practice. Finally, I'd like to thank you, Chair, and the committee for hearing me on this issue, and I'd be happy to provide further information if it would be useful.
Well, thank you very much for those introductory remarks, Richard. I think you've set out very clearly the situation as it impacts on you and other residents in the Barbican. Can I just clarify, I know that which are the lines that actually run underneath the Barbican?
The Hammersmith and City, the Circle and the Metropolitan.
So Hammersmith and City, Metropolitan and
Circle.
the Circle.
So
Okay.
these are three of what TfL calls the subsurface lines, the fourth being the district, which doesn't run underneath
Right.
us.
I'm now going to move on to the next guest who's just sitting to your left. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us, Luce Jacovella, who is a resident near Euston, and I believe may, if we're going to have a competition about decibels, may be able to go higher. Yes. And I believe is impacted by two different lines, which are the Northern Line and the Victoria Line specifically. Yes. If you could set out relatively briefly, there will be plenty of opportunities for all of you to come back. I know that everyone could probably talk for quite a long time on the impact and also on neighbours as well. But just to make sure that we get a good chance to hear from TfL and to think about some other aspects. But if you can talk about impact and then also talk about any kind of attempts to seek solutions and how that's gone for you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak on behalf of for my case and for also my neighbours. My name is Luce Jacovella. I live on the ground floor between Euston and King's Cross, above both the Victoria and the Northern Line. I've been living in my property for over 9 years without any reason for complaining. This changed suddenly on the 13th of August 2016, just a week before the launching of the night tube. I immediately contacted TfL. It took 2 months for the engineers to come and to measure the noise, other 3 months just to send the report. In fact, the report was sent to me only after writing to the members of the London Assembly out of frustration for the lack of response. The report shows level of noise way above the legal limit. It indicates 52 decibels from the Victoria Line. We are now in March, 7 months after the launching of the night tube, and the noise is getting even worse. I do some recording and with an app, and this shows a level of noise reaching 65 decibels on rush hours. Sometimes it's even possible to get a conversation with people when I'm home. So I'm not an engineer, but perhaps speed and traffic might be one of the relevant factors. I hope for improvements in the future, and greening works have been promised. The noise is affecting my health and my work and my life right now. My health has deteriorated to the point that my GP asked me to move out, and my property is simply unfit to live in. So basically, I'm a new category of homeless, a mortgage-paying homeless. It would be a challenge for anyone to survive with only 20 hours sleep per week. I often faint, I fall asleep while talking to people. Hopefully it doesn't happen now. I suffer from constant headaches. My hearing is damaged and develop tinnitus. Moreover, I displayed the physical aspect, the demeanor of a person that has not slept for months, literally. You can imagine I have the impact on my work. I often had to represent my institution with funding agencies. I had to take decisions that are affecting other people, and I'm not in condition to do my job properly. Out of despair, I contacted possibly anyone. I guess some of you might recognize my name from the many emails I sent around. And the only thing I ask is to be able to sleep and to adopt measures that would restore the level of noise to the legal limit of 35 decibels. I'm incredibly disappointed by the fact that Transport for London threw me and my neighbours in such a misery without even a plan to prevent noise. Before the launching of the night tube. There is no urgent response unit. When you approach customer service, they reply with a script, like an automated machine. There is no compensation scheme that I've been told of, and any response seems to be improvised. My concern is, although greening works have been promised, what would happen when it's not effective? What would it happen when the effect will wear off? Shall I start all this ordeal again? And I've asked my neighbors how and whether the tube is affecting them and is affecting people in different ways. For example, one of my neighbors said that he's affected by the works that have been carried out during tube closure times. And others are afraid to speak up because of Brexit. So they don't want to attract attention upon themselves, so they ask me to somehow to represent them. So please take this issue seriously. I'm not a technical person, but I wish really to see this problem resolved quickly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we are taking this issue seriously, which is why we're devoting some time to discussing it this morning. And then we won't just discuss it. We will come up with some recommendations from the committee as to how we think things can be improved. I'm going to move on to Ian, who's now going to talk us through the impact in Marylebone on himself and also on his neighbours. And which are the tube lines that are the ones nearest to you?
It's the Jubilee line.
It's the Jubilee.
Yeah.
So we're getting a good cross-section here of lines, and also someone affected for 20 years, someone affected since last August. So do give us your...
We're not at these decibel levels, so I do feel slightly guilty after hearing that. So please hit your gavel if I go on. The points I'd like to make are under two headings. I'm just going to give you some facts about our case, first of all, and then the process that we've been through. We first complained in October 2015, so this is well before the introduction of the night tube. We are affected by the north and southbound Jubilee line running from Bond Street to Baker Street. Our house is in fact 30 metres away from the tube based on London Underground's maps. It actually goes underneath some of our neighbours. Both the north and the southbound give us different degree of problems at different times. So we registered a complaint in October 15. In February 16, the Evening Standard ran an article about the pending night tube, and that caused us quite a lot of concern. And because of the article, we then copied the article to all the people in our community and said, are you aware of this? Of which, as a result of that, 12 homes then came back and said, no, we weren't, we're aghast. Will you, if you're doing this, Ian, which I don't really want to do, but you do, will you please represent us? So I have a list of 12 people in my community. TfL have that list, everybody has that list. And I want to just refer very quickly to that Evening Standard article, even if I don't get through everything else, which was in February 2015, of which there are 3-4 sentence points I'd like to read out. But Labour has warned the planned service, which will operate on the Jubilee Victoria Central Piccadilly Northern, could cause misery for thousands of families who complain about noise made by the poor track conditions. It's called for a noise-busting team to be set up to repair broken tracks before the launch of the night tube and to reduce noise at antisocial hours. The TfL risk assessment warned that services would mean an increase in overnight disturbance that could result in, quote, a reduction in quality of life for residents through disturbed sleep and even, quote, threats of suicide. It identified a 4 in 5 risk that residents who live close to and above tracks would be disturbed at night by noise and vibration. Labour's Transport Secretary Val Shawcross: residents regularly complain about noise made by poor tube tracks. When the night tube starts, it will mean even more misery. TfL seems set to accept that thousands of families could see the quality of their life reduced to the point of some threatened suicide. That's just not a risk they should ignore. Now, that was a kind of bombshell when that article came out. So as a result, we now have a community that are concerned by the noise, which of course is a different league with the night tube. We've had 3 grinding exercises, so we know London Underground have been trying, the first in February 16, 2 later. They affect the noise. I won't go into any more detail, as much as my good friend here has said, by anything up to 3 decibels. Quite frankly, as the human ear doesn't really perceive those kind of differences. I don't know anywhere where grinding has provided a long-term solution. My understanding is grinding is done anyway, and I can be corrected just to manage the tracks, whether it's for noise reduction or not. We've been through periods living in our home and not living in our home just to protect our health. Once the night tube was introduced, we took the decision to move out of our home. We wrote to the managing director and told them that we are not living in our home. We are still hanging on a promise that there will be some permanent solution. There are letters from our MP. We've had a lot of support from Valerie Shawcross, ironically, up to the point of the mayoral elections. And we wrote to the MD last month of TfL, Mark Wilde, and he's perfectly aware of our situation. So, very quickly process, over the last, I'm turning into 2 years of quite intense stress dealing with TfL. Of course, we all support the night tube. This isn't an issue. It's a done deal that we all support the night tube. We're all Londoners. We know what's going on. My experience with the response of TfL over the previous 18 months is it's been very slow. The one exception I've had since the introduction of the night tube has been actually Mark Wilde, who's the managing director. There are 2 emails. October 16, we have an email from him that says, I do not want our transport system to work in a way that impacts negatively on others. Our neighbours should not have to suffer noise disturbance from our network, and I have given Val assurances I take these matters seriously. Again in December 16, after we told him we've moved out, until he solves the problem. I'm very sorry to hear that you've decided to temporarily move out. No one should have to move out due to the running of our service, unquote. The last 4 points I'd like to make. Independent regulations on TfL. This has been mentioned before. A lot of people consistently bring up this point, and I am utterly in the dark to understand what the bottom line is. But it seems that TfL are not regulated with noise by any particular body, and somebody really needs to get a handle on this. Of course, the World Health Organization has very specific guidelines and extensive reports. My understanding is TfL can choose to ignore these. There are considerable Euro Commission guidelines on health. I understand TfL can choose to ignore them. And likewise with Westminster Planning or environmental health decibel readings, they ignore those. You're never going to get complaints from Crossrail. There won't be a Crossrail department saying we have a noise issue, because it's been dealt with effectively at source. And that's what we need with the system now, with an antiquated system. My 2 final points are that the decibel interpretation seems to be very subjective, and I would ask you please to look at that. I don't want to be prioritised over somebody that has less decibel reading than me. My view is quite simply that nobody should suffer night tube noise. End of story, and that should be the objective. Our health is being affected by this. I don't understand why the Mayor of London can have such an active policy to protect our health with things like diesel fumes, and in full knowledge of what is now happening, then impose this kind of detrimental effect on our health with the introduction of the night tube. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask Liz and Rosanna to be quite snappy then, because that was 6 minutes that we've just had from Ian, so I don't want to cut you short, but if you can just make sure that you're very, very focused. And I'm assuming, Archway, that this must be the Northern Line, and then if you could go into the description of your situation and your neighbours. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. It would be helpful if you can just give me a quiet indication, because it's very hard when you're speaking to actually know how long you've spoken for once you kind of start. So
okay.
If you can just raise your hand diplomatically when I've kind of overrun whatever you feel this should be the maximum.
And if you could lean forward slightly to the microphone, I know that...
Is that better?
Yes, I know that my colleagues will find that easier.
Okay. The area that I represent is Archway, and it's the Northern Line, and the line runs directly underneath the A1 Archway Road. And the area that we're talking about is between Archway and Highgate. I moved into the area in 1999, so I've been there for 18, 19 years now. When I first moved into the house, I couldn't hear any tube noise upstairs at all. Downstairs, there was a very faint kind of rumbling noise, which was actually quite pleasant. It was absolutely not disruptive. In 2013, I suddenly started to hear a lot more noise. It's a 3-storey house, and I could hear the noise right up and down. So I started, because we have quite a flourishing community in our area, I started to talk to other people about whether they also could hear noises that they hadn't been able to hear before. And a number of people said they could, some people said they couldn't, and we have to bear in mind the fact that a lot of people do things with their houses, like, for example, if you take up the boards on my ground floor, you touch the earth underneath. So basically there is a direct route from, for noise up into my house. Some people have installed new floors, concrete floors, all kinds of things. So some people can hear noise and some can't. Anyway, we decided to talk to Transport for London, London Underground, and they sent in engineers in January 2014. So that's 3 years ago. They measured the noise, and the noise in one direction was 43 decibels, and in another direction was 30 decibels. At the time, the engineers said that the rails needed to be reground and should be renewed within 3 years. Now, what happened next was quite extraordinary. I want to focus on this for a bit. The engineer's report came back very quickly in our case, and almost immediately we got a message, an email from the community relations manager at that time in early 2014, who said this is an urgent problem, the rails need to be reground. He gave us a date for that spring, which was sort of 2014 still, and he agreed that the rails needed to be reground. The time came and absolutely nothing happened. We wrote 3 times to the community relations manager saying, you promised us this, but why didn't it happen? We had no reply. At the end of January 2015, so this is a whole year later, we got a message to say that it would be ground in March 2015. Again, it didn't happen. Now, I won't go laboriously through the saga, but this saga went on and on and on. We were given dates, they weren't fulfilled. We wrote, there was no answer, apart from an acknowledgement saying, we got your letter, we'll act on it. The point I want to make is that in the end, the rail grinding took place in April 2016. So that's nearly 2.5 years after we raised the issue. And one of the things you asked us to refer to was what we consider to be TfL's, London Underground's, treatment of us. And what I want to say is that treating the public like that is cavalier and it's disrespectful. I've worked in the public sector for decades. If I make a promise, I fulfill it. If I'm not able to kind of stick to that promise, then I warn people in advance. The fact that we were promised all these dates in sequence, they didn't happen, and we were not warned that they wouldn't happen, is very, very disrespectful to the public. Anyway, finally, Andrew Pollins wrote to us to say that it would happen. It did happen. We've had the measurements taken again recently, and interestingly, they were taken last month. It showed that the southbound trains had increased in decibels by 4, and northbound trains, thankfully, have decreased by 6. So, as you say, grinding is not a panacea. I think our point is that something very important has happened, okay? Something very important has happened since we had that grinding, and that is that we've had the night tube. So what was acceptable when there's background noise is not acceptable when you have a ground floor bedroom, as I have, and you cannot sleep because you hear rumbling. The trains come past every 15 minutes, and that's in both directions all night on Fridays and Saturdays. I absolutely concur with my colleagues who've spoken before, which is this is not tolerable, this is not right. And also TfL has treated, I think, the public very, very badly in not responding to our complaints. I'm going to stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. Last but very much not least, Rosanna, and again I'm going to assume, because you're living in Mornington Crescent, that this is probably a Northern Line issue. So there's a bit of repetition here of Northern Line issues, which I will want Duncan to comment on. But of course, Mornington Crescent, again, is one of these areas where there's a sort of crossover situation with the lines. But if you could tell us your situation and also any of your neighbours to illuminate further from everyone else.
Thank you for the opportunity. I've lived in Mornington Crescent since December 2013 in a newly renovated house. The whole thing was renovated. I lived completely noise-free, didn't hear anything, any ground-borne noise or vibration, until the 31st of October 2016, when suddenly I started to feel and experience significant ground-borne noise and vibration, which is very interesting, the point, because November the 18th is when the night train started in that area. I contacted TfL the following day, and subsequently, an engineer came on the 9th of November. I'll tell you my own readings. They went up to 53 on the southbound Bank branch. So interestingly, though Mornington Crescent only has the Charing Cross branch coming through, the offending branch is more the Bank branch. So I had 53 on the southbound and 44 on the north, both above the thresholds, the acceptable thresholds. And by my vibration levels were 89 on the southbound and 29 on the north. My understanding is the limit should be 20 is the threshold, so it's 89. So in my home, in my basement, which is my living area, it's relentless. Every couple of minutes you hear these trains going up and down. The furniture vibrates, the radiators vibrates, and there's vibration in the floors. It's just constant and relentless. I've spoken to some neighbours. When I contacted TfL on the 1st of November, they told me at least 4 other people had complained. And it's quite scattered. Majority are in Mornington Crescent, but there's also Arlington Road, Beatty Street, Nelson's Yard, and on the other side in King's Terrace. So the common thread from all the neighbours whom I have spoken to is that the noise, and some of them have lived there for more than 9 years, that they've either heard the noise for the first time or it suddenly increased its levels around that time in November. In terms of the impact, the noise and vibrations, I've just told you about how relentless it's affected my sleep patterns. I've never had a problem sleeping before, but I do now. Some of the neighbours have complained about anxiety and also affecting their sleep patterns. And one person is no longer able to rent his basement room out, which he was getting £800 on for a month, because of this issue. So at a time when London is struggling for housing, you've got people not being turned away. So as a result of the readings taken by TfL, trackside and in some of our homes, they found that the southbound branch is the one that's most offensive, so therefore they're looking at remediating that. They're looking at track softenings. It's called track fastenings, I believe. They've received that. They're receiving it at the end of March, and they'll start work on the southbound branch. Now, we don't know whether that'll work, but we have to wait and see. So that's one of my questions, is what happens if it doesn't work? But I know of at least 4 people whose readings have been taken, and the northbound readings are all above 40. But we have asked TfL, why are you not considering it? Because the southbound branch has concrete sleepers, whereas the northbound branch has timber sleepers, so the same technology doesn't apply. So the track fastenings will not work on the northbound branch. So we asked them, why aren't you even considering it now? And they said they haven't started to consider it because they've got limited resources and they have to prioritize across London. That doesn't help us, because having read a redacted report from TfL in preparation for the night tube, I think it was written around 2014, all the lines in that area are rated C or D, which is bad, and they're only going to get worse. So if nothing's going to be done on the northbound branch, we're going to, these decibels are going to increase further. And we've been told that they can use grinding, but as we've all heard today, grinding may or may not help. But the ultimate thing is the tracks need to be replaced, and they have to be replaced at some time, because whilst I know of at least 15 people who are currently impacted by this, there could be many more whom I'm not aware of and who haven't complained. Just one key point also is with one of the people in the neighbourhood had seen people waiting to go into the Mornington Crescent station because he comes home from work very late every night. So he's been seeing people in overalls waiting to go in during engineering hours. And his recollection was that it was in the October-November time frame, which is exactly the time that we all started to experience this issue. So my points are, questions is southbound, if it fails, what's going to happen? Northbound, you really need to consider it. Why are you not considering it? And why is this sudden commencement of noise? I've raised this question with TfL a couple of weeks ago. I'm still waiting for the answer. We've asked them what have they done, and also when the concrete sleepers were recently installed, because that was mentioned in one of the reports. So I'll wrap up there.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. And I think that's very helpful to have the spread that we've had. But as well as those of you who've been able to join us today and to speak to the impact in your local area, we've also received quite a large amount of correspondence from people in other areas who are also suffering similar problems and issues. And what seems to be the situation from our perspective, we've tried to map them, and there definitely seem to be some hotspots in terms of noise. So we haven't heard today, especially from the group at Kennington, where again there are the number of the Northern Line branches come together. You've got the Bank branch and the Charing Cross branch, North and South, so 4 platforms. South Wimbledon, again, also on the Northern Line. But there are some definite hotspots. Now, I'm sure my colleagues are going to want to get into the detail now with all of you, thank you, but also addressing to TfL. And I'm going to start with Andrew, who I know has been dealing with this on behalf of a number of residents for some time.
Yeah, Lut and Rosanna are constituents of mine. I've got a letter here written by the Mayor of London, Sadiq, to Florence Ashalomi, Assembly Member, who's Chair of the Transport Committee, the 15th of August 2016. This is a question for TfL, really. What these people have had to say. What the Mayor wrote was this, and presumably this was a letter drafted on his behalf by TfL and signed by him a TfL draft. Anyone disturbed by the night tube should contact TfL's 24/7 customer service team on, then it gives the number. Everyone is guaranteed a personal response and an effective, speedy investigation. This may involve visits to residents' homes to get more information and to keep people up to date with the action being taken. Now, that's what the Mayor promised the people of London. And you've heard here from residents who I suspect would think that is a laughable statement. And I can certainly say from correspondence I've had from other residents in my constituency that they would think that was rather laughable as well. So how do you square what you wrote for the Mayor to send out to the Chair of the Transport Committee and by extension Londoners with what you've heard today?
Well, I do apologise on behalf of Transport for London that you are experiencing issues with noise that's affecting your life.
Duncan, I'm going to have to ask you to speak up because I know some of my colleagues are definitely going to say...
Sorry, I thought the microphone would pick me up. I inherited, for want of a better word, the noise and vibration as a complete entity before we introduced Night Tube. So I had a team of engineers and managers who were tasked with looking at the operation and maintenance requirements in order for us to introduce Night Tube. And
Sorry, could you just say when that was? When did you...
when I personally...
Yes.
Well, I was involved in the inception of Night Tube 2 or 3 years ago, but
Right.
I've moved around in the company, and I'm now head of operational engineering for London Underground. As part of that role, I was asked to look at the noise and vibration issues that were being experienced, and I also managed the business improvement team, who are Six Sigma Lean specialists in the organisation. And I asked them to look at why we were receiving numerous complaints that we weren't handling the complaints we were receiving in an efficient manner. So I had a review of the way that we dealt with complaints and found out that it was, for want of a better word, disjointed. And there were a number of different mechanisms that complaints were received. And we were recording how many complaints we were receiving and how many complaints were being dealt with in the complaint process, but not actually dealing with the root cause and ensuring that we looked at it from an engineering solution. So I've simplified the process, and everyone's absolutely committed to delivering a much better service through the process that's been adopted.
When was that?
That was in the late summer of last year.
So how do you explain then the complaints we're continuing to get that are not being processed very effectively since then? I mean, presumably, the Mayor's letter of the 15th of August is around the time that you put this new system into place, which is presumably what the Mayor's tried to reflect in good faith in his letter to Claire Shalomi, but it doesn't seem to have happened, does it, from what you've heard today?
Well, a number of these ones, there were engineering solutions that clearly have to be planned and executed. So
No, but people not being told what's going on, or being given dates and nothing happening, or told something's going to happen and it doesn't happen. That's not engineering solution, that's communication.
I believe, well, my colleague, I'll have to go back to my colleague, but he is in correspondence with a number of the people who are leading the residents' committees to give them assurance of what our engineering proposals are. And what we have to do is we have to go and evaluate what the complaint is to actually quantify it, because, as you've already heard, there is a spread of decibels that people are impacted on. So we have to go out and quantify what the issue is, and then we try and identify which of the lines is actually causing the issue. We have a number of different mechanisms. We do that, visual inspection, we have automatic train monitoring systems on some lines. So we try and identify what the cause is, and then, depending on what that cause is, and also the track formation, we then look to come up with an engineering solution. Some of them...
I think Jeanette's going to come on to some of the engineering stuff later on. I'm more concerned about how you deal with the people here, rather than the engineering solutions, which Jeanette will ask you about shortly. See, what I'm concerned about is people being, frankly, messed about, not their complaints being brushed under the carpet. Perhaps if they had a thicker carpet, it might help a bit. I mean, let me give you a couple of questions along those lines, okay?
Sure.
We've heard from the residents today that they lived perfectly happily for some time, then suddenly, bang, there's a trigger. And we've got absolutely specific actual dates when things changed. Now, why? Something must have happened to change what was a perfectly habitable home into a nightmare. Something must have happened on that date, or the day before, or 2 or 3 days before. Why, if you investigate complaints promptly, can't that specific thing be identified and dealt with?
Well,
because the problem is,
in each of
it's
these
taking you several months in some cases, certainly weeks in many, several months in other cases, to actually get round to doing that inspection. Now, actually, if you acted promptly on what the complaint was, you might be able to identify either from your maintenance records or something else what the cause was.
Well, from the point of when we actually receive a complaint, and I also manage the noise and vibration team who monitor, who have the monitoring equipment, they will contact the resident within a working week to try and find a mutually acceptable time they can then go and carry out.
I don't think the people around here think that, and certainly from the other complaints I've had, people don't think that either. That might be what you think's happening, but on the ground it doesn't seem to be.
Well, with respect, most of these are quite long-standing complaints. I can only talk about the process that I've now brought in, that I'm absolutely sure anybody who complains to us about noise, they will get the response that I believe is reasonable, which is within 1 working week, we will then sort out with them a mutually acceptable time that we can come and quantify the issue. Because we have some complaints, for example, where there are a number of different lines in the proximity of the property, and we have to identify which of those lines is actually the cause of the noise that they're experiencing.
Okay. No, I accept that, but
So-
you haven't answered my specific question, is when you get a particular complaint suddenly happening on a particular date, why don't you try to identify what happened on that date? Because that might short-circuit everybody's problem, trying to identify what's going on. I mean, Rosanna gave you a specific date, Lewis gave you a specific date, and the other people probably did the same.
Well, some,
Can I speak?
Yes,
Is it
of course,
okay?
no.
Yeah.
Do come in.
I did ask the question as to why it started on the date, and we raised this question, and we said, have you carried out any structural or non-structural changes during this period? Because it was very specific, as you just mentioned. They said no, but then recently somebody in the neighbourhood had seen these people during that period, and just seems too much of a coincidence because people have all experienced it at that point in time. In my day, they've said around November, for me 31st of October.
Yeah,
It's very
yeah.
specific.
Is there an explanation that could lead us to some sort of issue that could have arisen in that way, Duncan? And also, can I just ask you, when you do the monitoring, you're doing the monitoring across all time periods. You're not just monitoring at the point of the night tube running or anything like that. It's for a whole period
we
of
will
time.
go to someone's property and we set up our test equipment, and we then try and
Hang on just a second.
we will then look to measure what the actual noise is, and then we work out from there exactly where the trains were in proximity of the property, looking at the time scale, so we can try and identify what the specific issue was on that line that caused the noise and monitoring equipment to record the level. So it might be there's a joint, so we then have to bring up an engineering solution of, do we replace that joint, can we weld? The main cause that we usually have of a sudden jump, as we've now found out, is the change from wooden to concrete sleepers has had an impact in some areas. The one that I specifically think of is in the Wanstead area, and we are looking to put resilient track fastenings in that area to address. But unfortunately, we can only do that on flat bottom rail, which I have here, and these are the resilient track fastenings, which are...
Well, we'll come to the engineering
a
stuff
rubberised
later on. I'm still focusing on complaint handling. I don't want to be diverting into the detail of engineering because Jeanette's going to probe you on that shortly. Let's get back to complaint handling. When you mentioned the sleepers, and I might want to ask you some questions about that after Jeanette's talked about that. But I come back to the point that you've got a specific date. If you move quickly, you might be able to identify it and deal with it more quickly. Can I go on then? Can I go on then to this business about the noise limits to which you work? Now we've got the World Health Organization limits.
We don't work to a specific noise limit. We
Why
treat
not?
each complaint individually, and we will look for an engineering solution to
So-
address that complaint. We don't set a limit
So
on
what
our noise.
threshold do you work to?
We don't.
So if somebody came and said, okay, come and look at my flat, I've got a 20 decibel problem with tube noise, which is virtually audible. What about that?
Well, we look to see if we can identify if there is a specific issue on that portion of line that is causing the noise to impact on the individual. There is
You see,
clearly there is a certain amount of noise that's going to be attributed to a moving metal or metal interface, but we look at each complaint individually and treat it on its own merits.
I have to say, I think that's been a bit disingenuous because from all the stuff I've seen and all the complaints I've seen is that once it gets beyond 50 dB seems to be a working limit to which you're using. It may not be an official sanctioned proposed number, but
That's
it
not
seems
the
to be
case.
what
I
you...
can
Well,
absolutely assure you that I manage the noise
well, all
and
the stuff
vibration
I've got
steering
here,
group.
and there's plenty of complaints here. I mean, Lisa's had that. Her flat was recorded at 52, and that she was told the limit was 50, and you weren't going to do anything else about it.
There are, when I took this over as a body of work, clearly I had to make sure that we started looking at the point of need first. So it wasn't, we put a heat map together. Just have to excuse me, I've got a number of pieces of paper here. where we have started to consolidate the complaints in an area. And we looked at the amount of complaints, the volume of complaints, and clearly the decibel levels experienced. And we have carried out major engineering interventions in those areas trying to address them. Now, unfortunately, Dr. Giacovella, which I do apologise to you, has slipped through the net on that one, so to speak. So we have made a commitment to grind next week, and we will then look at what
Say
impact
something.
that
I
has.
think Luce would like to come in.
Just
comment.
I've written to TfL every single week for months. How can I have been slipping through the net? I mean, I guess most of
You have emailed me a lot as your constituency
I've
AM,
written to
and that's all been
anyone
passed on to TfL.
who has even a remote say on the matter, and clearly the level of noise is an intolerable level.
No, unacceptably high.
And how can my case have been slipped through and the net is, sorry. It's just
Well, my focus, it was about consolidating them into areas, because it's not a limit on funding, it's a limit on the actual physical resources that I had available to me and the time scale that I've had to start getting the maximum amount of impact.
Oh, so you don't have the resources you need to deal with
No, I
these
do
people's
have-
problems?
We have to run an operational railway in the sense of I have a limited amount of engineering hours available to me. It's not a financial constraint I'm under, it's about how much work I can realistically plan and execute in the time available.
So,
Right, so your constraint is more about the fact that if we were going to, let's say, fix the whole of the Northern Line, it would be slightly inconvenient for all of the people who are using it if you had to shut it for 2 weeks to undertake all of the work. So it's more to do with the small size of the windows when different parts of the underground system can be taken out. Is that what you're saying? And
So
presumably
we
you have
have
to
to
compete with other activities that might wish
Yeah,
to be...
we have a certain amount of access available to us, so we have other works that have been undertaken.
No,
so
the
we
fact-
have to almost leap
hang
from
on a
place to
minute.
place and do that.
hang on a minute. You have so many engineering teams, yeah? I mean, I've been down on the Northern Line with them overnight, and I've seen how much work they can actually get done, both in terms of relaying track and also in terms of fixing broken rails and points and so forth.
We do have a supply chain I can call on as well.
So you've got supply chain constraint, you've got the number of
No, I
staff.
don't have a constraint with the supply chain. I've unlimited resources in the supply chain. My limiting factor is actually gaining access to the track and also having, for example, the resilient track fastenings have been a really
But
good
come on
solution.
to the engineering solutions later on, okay?
But there is a lead time for us actually
I'm more
procuring
concerned
those.
about how complaints are dealt with. As I've said that several times now. Jeanette will probe the engineering solutions. She's done a lot of work on that. What I'm concerned about is getting to the bottom of the story about why these people's complaints are not being dealt with. And part of it seems to me there has to be capacity constraints on you. Now you said it's the hours that you can have a closure and the electricity turned off. I understand that. But if you had twice as many teams working on replacing broken points or putting in whatever it happens to be, or cracked rail, you could do twice as many bits of rail, couldn't you?
I think that's a simplistic view of it, that we have other activities we have to undertake in the railway. Now, for example, grinding has been one of our solutions. We have 2 grinders available to us, but we do tend to, for efficient use of the grinder and also making sure we have complaints on a number of the lines. We go end to end on the lines. We can't just hopscotch around with a grinder. That's not a realistic use of our resource.
Fine. So that is a resource constraint. So can I go back though to the question I put to you, which is
Even
about
if I bought 50 grinders, that still wouldn't address the individualised problems. You have to go from end to end. So if you start on the Northern Line, it's much more efficient to start from
I think
the top
we've
and
already,
go
I think
through.
we've already decided, or you've tried to divert me along the lines of that grinding isn't the solution to all these things. There's all sorts of other things that could be done as well, which presumably don't require going up and down the Northern Line.
Well, there's different issues in different areas. So we have
Correct.
to deal
So
with those
if
on
you had
individual
more
merits.
teams, you could do more of the other bits and pieces that don't require grinding, but we'll come back to the technical stuff later on. And coming back to my point about the noise limits. Now, you have no benchmark to work to, is what you're telling me, in terms of no objective figure, which you can say to people,
I
okay,
haven't put
objectively...
I haven't put constraints on our teams of what we will and what
No.
won't
Don't
address.
you think
We
it would,
address
don't you
all
think it
complaints
would
individually.
inspire more public confidence if you actually had a benchmark, for example, a WHO figure, to which to work.
Well, the WHO figure would be, for example, in the Northern Line extension, it's about infrastructure you're going to install to ensure that it will not exceed certain noise parameters. We have up to 150-year-old assets, and they haven't been designed to mitigate noise.
Right.
So
what you're
we
saying
have to then
is,
look to retrospectively engineer solutions that will
okay, so what
deal
you're
with
saying
people's
is
individual
the WHO
events.
figures you're not going to adopt because you have no prospect of meeting them.
Well, if I adopted the WHO figures, I could probably exclude a certain number of the people's complaints, but that's not actually addressing the issue. People are feeling that they've been impacted by the
Well, I think if you
underground,
adopt,
and
I think if
therefore
you
I'm going to see if I
adopted,
can solve their problem.
I think if you adopted the WHO figures, these people here wouldn't be complaining at all. If you were meeting them,
Well, there would be at least one person sitting at this table that we probably wouldn't look for a solution because they are not impacted by the WHO guidelines.
Isn't the WHO figure, and my understanding was that there were controls over levels of noise in terms of the increasing impact and likelihood of permanency of damage to the human ear. So isn't the 40 decibel mark one of the ones that where you're more likely to find that people are disturbed? So, you know, sorry to cut in, Andrew, but wouldn't it be useful in terms of saying, you know, these are going to be our absolutely top priority? And you said you've been heat mapping to start with those
We
first.
started with those over 40 decibels was our priority, and we had to look at, there were areas where you started clustering them. So I've got my heat map here, I've just seen it. So we had a look at those areas. So it's probably very difficult to see, and I can distribute it at the time. And then we clustered them, and we started dealing with those areas because clearly that had the greatest impact. So
Might
that
be
was to do
helpful
with
if
the
we can-
decibel levels
Perhaps
and
we
the
can
amount
provide
of
that
people impacted.
to the committee to have a
but
look
I
at.
still come back to my basic question.
Yeah.
Why can't you have a benchmark, an objective noise figure in decibels above which nobody should be expected to put?
We did discuss that, and I raised it because I'm an engineer. It was the first thing that I raised was what is the cut-off point that we will and won't address people's concerns. And the view within the company at the time was that wasn't appropriate. We were having an impact on those individuals, and if we could find a solution to mitigate it, then we would. So it might be, for example, a joint that was knocking. It might just need tighten, but it was having an impact on them. Even if it was 35 decibels, it was having an impact.
But if you have a benchmark above which nobody should have to tolerate, that at least lets people know, okay, so you may do better than your benchmark. Obviously a target, if people can exceed their targets, everybody's even happier. But you've got people across London who are dissatisfied. They don't know what to expect from TfL other than, from what I can see, a pretty rubbish service. And frankly, if you actually had a number to which you were working, people, I think, would feel a lot more satisfied.
Well, the greatest respect, Mr. Dismore, I don't think there's anyone at this side of the table would be remotely satisfied if I turned around to them and said, I'm really sorry, but you're only at 39.5 decibels, so we're not going to do anything.
There'll
No,
be
that's
other,
not what I
there'll be other
That
people.
would be a massive improvement for many people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not what I put to you. I said, if you have a benchmark, you've got something to work to, and you can always do better than that. But it's about letting people know what is a reasonable expectation. And, of course, you can do better by doing a small fixing a joint or something. Of course, you do that, but that's the problem. What about dealing with local authority noise teams? Do you deal with those?
No, I don't. I don't personally, no.
Right.
My colleague does.
Because I've got a complaint, one of the complaints here, which came from Marylebone, said that Westminster Council's environmental health team took up complaints on residents' behalf because they could get nowhere with TfL. And she understands that TfL have yet to respond to the Westminster Council environmental health team about their
Were
complaints.
you able to add something to that?
Yes, we do deal with environmental health officers and other colleagues in the different councils. And just to say, all noise legislation is local because of the sensitivity of different people who hear noise differently according to their circumstances. So that's why it's dealt with. There is legislation for this in the local statutory nuisance guidelines.
So when somebody tells me Westminster Council's environmental health team made complaints on behalf of a number of residents from Marylebone and haven't had a reply, they're wrong, are they?
No, I didn't say that at all. We deal with a lot of councils. If there's a particular case there, then I'm happy to take it away and to look into why that's been a problem, certainly.
Sorry, Richard.
I think Richard
Can
wanted
I
to
intervene
add to
on
that.
this point? We in the Barbican had a meeting with TfL that was organised by the City of London Environmental Health Team. I've asked TfL 5 times for minutes of that meeting and have not received them. I mean, it's, you know, this just goes to underscore how really terrible your organisation is in doing the basics.
It does seem to be a
speak
bit
to
of an
colleague.
issue here about the level of responses. Would you agree? I mean, certainly at some points when Andrew was putting points to you, Duncan, I could see every single person sitting here nodding, that they'd obviously experienced some of those delays in coming back to them as customers who are experiencing difficulty. Would you accept that there are still improvements that are required in terms of the response to customers when they're experiencing these difficulties?
Clearly, we're not meeting people's expectation if they're complaining. So I will discuss that with my colleagues. I do have on occasion had that raised to me as an issue, and when I do speak to my colleagues in the communications team, they assure me that there is a two-way dialogue going on. Now, sometimes there is a lag between when we correspond with them and when the proposed solution is going to be undertaken, and then we have to go back and reevaluate the impact of that engineering work. So, but there needs to be a better communication. That
2.5 years, I think as Liz was saying, 2.5 years, and the work getting put back and put back and put back and not being told why. I've also got similar problems in East Finchley, actually, where people are being messed about. In this
well, as I stated at the beginning, it was when I took over this process, I did find out it was quite localised with some of the solutions. Now we have a much more centralised approach
that one's
to this.
still ongoing in East Finchley. Last area I want to explore with you before Jeanette comes in on the engineering stuff is this. People here, take Luce for example, her home is uninhabitable. What's she supposed to do? And I think Rosanna's in a not dissimilar position. What are they supposed to do?
Sorry, I don't understand what your question is.
Luce's problem, I mean, you can see, just looking at her, she's clearly emotionally distressed by what's been happening. Rosanna's problem, very significant noise levels. Luce's problem is her flat is effectively uninhabitable. Rosanna's got similar problems too. What are they supposed to do?
Ian has moved out.
And Ian's
I've
moved out,
too. In fact, I haven't been sleeping in my property for weeks, as I occasionally do if I don't find a bed. And I've been trying to, because I can't afford to, a rent and a mortgage at the same time. I can't rent my own property because nobody is willing to move there. And so I sometimes babysitting, do house sitting, and I sleep occasionally on sofas. So while carrying out a full-time job. So yes, I am distressed, and I have, to the point of collapsing. So I thank you for your question. What I'm supposed to do?
Yeah. What are they supposed to do?
Well, I've heard someone whispering it's a rhetorical question.
It's not a rhetorical question, actually. It's a genuine question. You've got people whose flats, because they live in basements or on the ground floor. We've heard also from Rosanna somebody who's lost significant amounts of money because they can't actually let a basement or ground floor flat. What are they supposed to do?
Well, I've come here today to discuss about the solutions that we're trying to put into place, and clearly there is an issue with the timescales that we're actually putting those solutions forward. I mean, I'm more here, I suppose, to reassure you that we are taking all complaints seriously and we're making appropriate interventions where we can.
What are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to move out while that work is done? If a flat is uninhabitable, if a flat's uninhabitable, if you're renting a flat and it's uninhabitable because there's damp in it and the landlord has to do major works, they're moved out either by the council, often by the council, and rehoused temporarily. What are they supposed to do?
Well, that's an individual decision.
It's not an individual decision, is it? If you look at Luce...
You've already stated about the 40 decibel parameter, then we would then have to take a view on what that would look like for different thresholds. I'm not in a position to determine what is the solution for people. All I can do is take their complaints on board and deal with them in an appropriate way to attempt to resolve them.
See, normally in environmental health concerns about somebody's property, they've got legal rights to take action against the landlord or the person causing the problem, haven't they? Are you some sort of special case?
I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't be able to make a comment on that.
Can I say something? The customer service has expressly told me that they don't have any compensation scheme, so that I would not be possible to claim compensation for damages. That's what I've been told.
No.
Can I say something? In terms of my response from the TfL, I've had a pretty good response compared with other people here, in that, you know, I complained on the 1st of November, but I kept ringing. I had to ring every week. And on the 9th of November, the engineer came round to my place, but since then it has been constantly every week to find out what's going on. And every week the engineers are, you know, and the customer services people have been very good, but it's the engineers just not coming back. Finally, in January, they told me we've got to order this stuff. They knew that they had to do this work all along, but then the ordering of the stuff took another 2 months. So in January, they made the decision, and it's coming in at the end of March. So 5 months we've waited just for these fastenings to come through, which you knew you had to do anyway. In terms of the thresholds, I'm horrified that you are not working to an acceptable threshold limit. Everybody does. We all work to guidelines, and if you don't have something as basic as a threshold, how can you prioritize? And this is why we went back, even on the northbound track, saying many of us have readings of above 40. What are you doing about it? And I think, frankly, the TfL are hoping that we will go away after the southbound remediation. And that's why they're just playing for time, because it's a completely different technology. You can't use the track fastenings. You've got grinding, you've got to use grinding. Apparently you've got ventilation issues. You've got to do something, because we cannot continue like this.
I can assure you that we're not playing a time game here and hoping that people are going to go away. I can absolutely categorically assure
Well,
you
why
that
don't
is
you
not
start
the case.
thinking about it then? Because it's a different problem. The southbound and northbound are two different problems, two different technologies. You
For
should
the
at least be
southbound, we
thinking about
have
it.
planned, I believe, an intervention in April for resilient track fastenings, which should
That's
deal
right.
with your immediate.
But
That's the
but the
problem.
point is, it took you months to find out what the problem was,
Absolutely.
then more months to actually get round to ordering the part.
No, they knew what the problem was, but they took 2 months to decide as to, well, they had even made a decision, but in terms of actually going to do it, and then they took another 2 months or more to get them from China.
Yeah. But I still come back to the question I was putting to you, Duncan. I mean, if you had to live in Lucy's flat, where you can see the state she's ended up in because of all this noise that you're experiencing, what would you do?
Andrew, I think actually, and I think it's extremely unfortunate that we don't have someone in addition to Duncan, whose role is the head of operational upgrades. I'm not sure that is your position to be able to answer that question. Certainly, if I look at the comparator with Crossrail 1, where there are some very large holes in the ground, lots of pile driving going on, lots of cement, lots of huge pieces of equipment. And I spoke to the teams at Bond Street, for example. It's very close to a lot of people's houses there. And one of the options that was offered by Crossrail 1 to the local residents was, would you like to move out during the duration of the works? Now, I don't think in your position as head of operational upgrades you're going to be able to answer, Andrew, as to whether or not people should be offered the opportunity to move out until the works are complete. And I think it's extremely unfortunate that we haven't got someone from TfL who can say that, or whether people should be compensated, or whether they should have weekend respite, which has also been offered by Crossrail 1. People have gone off to hotels at Crossrail's expense for weekends. I don't feel that you're in a position really to answer that. So I think I'm going to, unfortunately, have to draw that to a close.
Okay. Well, can I just say, Chair?
Well, I think we need to move on to Jeanette, because otherwise we're going to run out of time, Andrew. I've given you a lot of time
let me just say this, Chair. HS2 is coming to Euston and Mornington Crescent. And one of the big issues around HS2 is precisely what you're talking about there. What arrangements will be put in place to mitigate the impact on residents?
Well,
all
I think
can say
that's
is,
out with the competence of this meeting,
and
which is on tube noise.
Yeah,
and Andrew, you've had half an hour.
Yeah.
I'm moving on to Jeanette now. We've only got 20 minutes left on this item. And I would like to now move on to Jeanette, who is going to talk about maintenance and engineering, which I think is probably more your backyard area, Duncan, in terms of operational upgrades, that we may go back into the impact, I think, on residents. And then we will want to talk about communication a bit more as well. Jeanette.
Chair, can I say a couple of things? Firstly, the time that we're allowed here will only give us the opportunity to start the exploration. And I think that has to be said to residents here and who are tuning in and who are part of this absolutely massive, it's like an epidemic, isn't it, really, across London. The scale of noise nuisance is absolutely widespread, and we've heard this morning it is damaging the health and well-being of Londoners. And I mean, one of the things that I'm just going to go and ask Duncan about is really how long TfL has known about this, because from the people I've worked with now for over 10 years building the case, it's clear to me that TfL should have known about this and should have taken this into consideration. I also want to start, Duncan, by welcoming your apology to Londoners for the distress, discourtesy and the disrespect that they have experienced over the years and continue to experience. And I want to ask you firstly about your structure, because you said you took over the noise and vibration issues last year, but you still have a structure, don't you, where you've got operational directors for a group of lines. Why I say this is that I met in November with Peter McNaught and his team, and they cover Bakerloo, Central and Victoria. Another meeting is another operational director, and so on. So my question is isn't your system set up in a sort of to create competition between these different groups in terms of who can get access to resources to deal with their concerns?
Each of these service directors have their own resources available to them for maintenance and operations. So they are essentially three separate directorates. The rationale behind me taking over the noise and vibration is I'm a centralised function. I provide engineering to each of the service directors for the Jubilee Northern and Piccadilly line, Bakerloo Central and Victoria line and the subsurface lines.
So let me get this right. So the resource for engineering is centralised directly by you?
It is.
But the three regional directors have to put in a bid to get access to that resource?
No, I ensure that I have the resources to support them on day-to-day activities for the reliability and also for engineering solutions on a wider footing. So for track, for example, that's an asset that is across all the directorates, and I have a track engineering team who focus on track as a complete entity.
Okay. So, let me then tease this out. So we know that there's a trial going on to reduce a particular nuisance, and I'm just moving away from noise nuisance, from the night train related nuisance at the moment, because what we have to recognise is that there's overground noise nuisance, there's above ground noise nuisance, there's a whole range of noise nuisance. The night tube actually seems to compound all these other noises. But tell us, why did you decide Central Line Woodford would get a trial? Was it because of their particular issue, or are you trialling that so that that can be used as a remedy for other similar noise in other areas? And what would be the resource implications for that? Have you already got that in the budget?
When we received the complaint from the residents at Woodford, we had a look at the track formation and we couldn't find any engineering or immediate engineering problem. So the track formation was in a good condition. There was no corrugation of the track. The fixtures and fittings were complete and there was no apparent cause. So it was what we call just the noise essentially that's generated by the central line trains going over the track. Clearly, it was causing disturbance to the people. That's why they'd complained, and that's why I asked my engineering team to source or innovate a solution. So they went out to the marketplace to see what else we could do above the usual interventions that we have, and they've found something called Quiet Rail, which is a spray-on solution onto the web of the rail, which is below the crown here. And we believe that that will stop some of the airborne noise through a damping.
Is that common in other places?
No, we're going to be the first people to trial that.
Sorry?
We're going to trial it. We are, sorry, we're leading the way on that.
Yeah, but is
that as a solution.
Yeah, is that particular noise nuisance to be found elsewhere within the TfL domain?
We believe there are other sites that we might be able to use that as an engineering solution if it does give us the reduction in noise that we're expecting.
Right. And what sort of decibel noise is that?
Well, the manufacturer is stating 6 to 7 decibels, and we believe
60?
6 or 7 decibels.
Right, 6 or 7 decibels.
Reduction.
Yeah. So, I mean, and it goes back to the point we're trying to say now, if there was some benchmark and we went to the World Health, then that sort of noise nuisance would be way down the list, wouldn't it be? Because the World Health decibel is about 35 to 38.
For that particular site,
yeah.
I'm afraid I'm not going to start shuffling around. I believe it's about 50 decibels for that because of the proximity of the property to the running track.
So they were experiencing 50?
Yes.
Okay. So that's one of the reasons why you tried to...
and this is airborne noise. There's two types of noise we experience. One's ground-borne, which is pulsing through the ground, and the other one's airborne.
Okay.
So this is solutions more for ground-borne noise. The Quiet Rail, we believe, will just stop the airborne noise of the train passing. Okay.
And I'm just asking about these things, because these things are shared. I mean, there's a very lively, quite proper network. And people are now knowing about the rubberised track called Delcor. How effective will this be? And is this site-specific, the use of something like that?
That's a much longer-term solution, and I wouldn't be able to give you an answer at this point in time. I could come back to you on that specific point.
Okay. So, do you know, what we really want to understand is how residents, going from what Andrew said, we know that we believe that the complaints system and the response, from what we've heard this morning and from what I know of many years of dealing with TfL, is so variable and in some instance haphazard. It's almost like luck of the draw. And, you know, Robert, and you're talking about having engineers and people at your house weekly.
No, I rang them weekly.
You ring them weekly?
Yeah, but they did come to my house too.
Yeah, so Duncan, I'm trying to get to a stage where would there be a standard? Are you looking to develop some sort of standard in terms of an engineering response to this epidemic of noise nuisance related to the underground and in some instance overground systems that TfL is responsible for?
We've got an agreed end-to-end process in the organisation. I manage the resources for a significant proportion of that process, but there are other interfaces that we have. So we have the customer centre. So we've got internal service level agreements between us of what's an appropriate timeline for response. So what I was looking for was a fair and consistent approach to noise and vibration complaints. And that's why I had a simplified process brought into use that everyone had to adopt. And I then hold a monthly steering group where we look through any specific issues that we have. But I hold a weekly review with my principal track engineer to go through each of the individual complaints just to make sure we're getting good traction on them.
Yeah. Are you in a position to provide us, after this meeting, with some sort of schedule that will show where you expect to be? I know that we've got some indications, like you've got on the Northern Line, a Kentish town, sometime something's happening there. in this month, and at Camden Town next month and stuff like that. But my sheet is totally incomplete because you don't have the work that's going on, as I know now at the moment, at Highbury and Angel, Seven Sisters. If Joanne McCartney was here, she'd be talking about work that's expected at Tottenham. And there's Elephant and Castle. I mean, it seems to me that every borough in London is at the moment affected. The residents in every borough in London is affected.
Well, I've got...
is that the schedule?
I've got my spreadsheet of 3 or more complaints because I didn't want to bring any more paper, but I do have individual plans for every single complaint that we have. And then I monitor those against a dashboard. So for Night Tube, we have no outstanding complaints of more than 90 days that I do not have a planned intervention for.
Right. You don't have a
So I've broken it down into less than 90-day complaints, 90 to 180-day complaints, complaints over 180 days. And
the
what
category...
we have is we've got a planned intervention for every single complaint that we've received greater than 90 days. Now, the reason I did it from 0 to 90 days, I could do it 0 to 45 days, is that we are beholden to people giving us access to their properties, so we can actually then carry out an evaluation, then go out and look at our various on-site inspections, our recording vehicles and so on, just as to establish the root cause of the problem and then come up with a plan of when we're going to undertake the work.
And when you're there...
Jeanette, can I just bring in Liz, who wanted to come in at that point as well?
I'm very interested to hear that after you've taken measurements and diagnosed a problem, excess noise, that you then look at the cause of it. Because your engineers came into our area in January 2014, but although we've been told no, we can't renew your track, as the engineers then promised, you have never given us any kind of reason for why we're hearing the noise. Have other people had the cause told to them?
Not a clue.
Because we would like to know what the cause is so that we can identify and relate to exactly the kinds of solutions, Jeanette, that we hear in our groups, in our emails. People are talking about rubber rails, but we would like to know what is the cause of the problem of the noise in our area. You may know, but we don't. So can we know, please?
Well, as a suggestion, I've got a full engineering report for each complaint that I receive, and we have the traces, etc., and it does have a conclusion and a recommendation for intervention. I've got no... I mean, if you suggesting as part of this process that we actually provide those reports, I'm quite happy to do that to people.
Obviously, we know what the reading is, but it's the cause of that reading that would be very interesting and useful.
And also the suddenness. Why did it start on a particular day? Nobody's told us why.
We've talked a bit about that before. Yeah. Jeanette, I just interrupted you so that we can bring in Liz.
I think that's a valuable question, because in some areas that I've been working on, Lisa, they don't have any idea what's causing. They haven't got a clue. And that's why in some areas they have to keep going back, and that's why we hear about the grinder going back 3 times. Ian, was it you who had the grinder, or was it 3 times? And so that's reducing it at a decibel. But I think the point here is if TfL was more open and more responsive and was able to say publicly, we have a problem here. In some instances, we absolutely do not understand, but we are going to keep our focus on it. Duncan, can you tell me how many times has this issue been to the board level? Do you know? Do you know if TfL's board has ever discussed this growing disturbance experienced by Londoners?
When I was asked to take over the noise and vibration steering group, I met with Mark Wild weekly until the last Night Tube service was run, and now I update Mark on a weekly basis. So once Mark had confidence that I was fully in control of the issue and then I was going to drive the appropriate solutions, he's taken the sort of hand off me, so to speak. But I had to meet him every single week and go through the numbers with him until he was assured that we were getting to grips with the problem.
I think there does still appear to be a gap, though, between what you're saying, Duncan, which sounds as though internally within TfL you have a plan for many individual cases, which Andrew and Jeanette have been eloquently raising along with our other guests. And then there seems to be a gap in terms of the information that's coming back to people, both on what the identified cause is that underlies, and I'm seeing a lot of nods now from a lot of the guests, and then you informing people what the cause is, and then also the timescale for coming back to actually implement the solutions. I think
that's a good summary, Chair, but can I just go back to Duncan and when he talked about the visits, their process they use, and we've heard, saying you've got a plan to implement and implementing it in TfL's world can mean 0 to 2 years. That's the experience of people. So what I want to understand is, you're saying there is no funding problems. You're saying that you've got engineers. You're basically saying, really, since you've taken over, you've got a handle on it, but you still have outstanding work around implementation that look as if they're going to be years rather than weeks and months.
I brought the reports here for the people I believe who were going to discuss their individual issues. So, for Ms Lawson in the archway, the noise was and is below the 40 decibels. We have ground it, and we ground it in spring of 2016. And there's been a 1 decibel rise since that grinding. So it was above 40 decibels, it was ground, and it then dropped down to 36 decibels from 43.
Southbound
and it's now
has
risen,
gone up.
unfortunately, to 37, and that's in the northbound. For the southbound, it was 33 decibels, and after grinding, it's remained at 33 decibels, and it's now risen to 34. So it's risen by 1 decibel in the year, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to do anything. We're now looking at a possibility of re-railing that site, because there is a corrugation issue, which is basically ripples on the track. And that comes back to the question of, do we have a cut-off point of 40 decibels? And the answer is no. It's still an issue to the residents of Archway, and we're going to see if we can carry out further works. Now, we've ground, and it's taken it below the 40 decibels, but we've still received a complaint. We're going to see if we can re-rail it.
Yes, just going to bring in Luce and then Liz again.
I heard to say one thing. Decibels were measured during the day, and already the response was over 52 decibels. My experience is that during rush hours is much higher, and as I mentioned, it reached 60, sometimes even 65 decibels, with trains passing through every 1.5 minutes. I wonder whether slowing down trains could be an initial solution, just to ease a bit the noise at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Duncan, do you want to just respond to those points?
Well, I've just gotten here. We've got grinding planned for next week, and we will come back as soon as you allow us access to your property to then look to see what the impact of that grinding was. Because clearly,
my property
I'm not going to, before I came here, I brushed up a bit more the individual issues, and 52 decibels is completely unacceptable in your house. So we are going to grind. We will look to see what impact that has, and then we will then look to do further engineering works if required to take it down to an acceptable level. And I started off the meeting, and I do apologise it's taken as long as it has to deal with your issue, because we have looked at it at a point of need. We've consolidated it and looked at the ones that were at the highest level and taken it down. But because, although you've said that you've spoken on other people's behalf, it was an individual complaint that has unfortunately taken far too long to deal with.
I'm going to bring in Liz, and then I'm going to bring in Richard, and then I'm going to come back to Jeanette, and then I'm afraid we are going to have to start to wrap this item up. But Liz, let's bring you back in.
I just wanted to say that it's nice that you've reassured the committee that you're still planning to regrind the rail, to re-rail the area that I'm in. But actually the email that I got yesterday didn't say that at all. It said that you've come back, done the measurements, which by the way have decreased by 6, but the southbound has increased by 4 since regrinding. But actually the end of the letter said, in view of the current readings, our engineers do not think that this is currently a situation that is appropriate for regrinding. We will take another measurement in 3 months. So actually, you're wrong to say that we've been sort of comforted in the fact that it's going to be re-railed. No, that's not what you said.
Richard, we'll just
We're
bring in
looking to see
Richard.
whether
Oh, do you
it
want
does
to answer
require
that
re-railing, is what I
specifically?
said.
Duncan, you said that the 62 dB is unacceptable, and that's great to hear. You said that you would bring it to an acceptable level. What is an acceptable level?
Well, that comes down to the threshold question, doesn't it?
What is an acceptable level? You said you're going to bring it to an acceptable level. What is that level?
Good question.
That's a subjective question. What I
You
can assure
said
you,
it, Duncan.
No, you're absolutely right. What I'm going to look at is every single engineering solution available to bring it down. There are some sites, and I can tell you that
Looking is very different to implementing.
Woodford is an example of a site. The noise from a central line train passing a property on a good quality track was 50 decibels. So there are certain areas. Now we're now looking to put quiet rail as an innovative solution to draw that down to a level that we can reasonably go to. We look at it as a case-by-case basis, and we'll keep on looking for engineering solutions to draw it down until
So
you have no
basically,
reason
what's
to
acceptable is what TfL decides. It's nothing to do with the experience of residents.
No, it's driven by your experience. It's not driven by a measure that we've put in place. That's why we haven't put a 40 dB threshold. We will continue to work with people to find solutions.
Can I
Like
just
Cambyses, the law is what I say it
Can
is.
I just ask, I mean, you've got your heat map of where the complaints are situated together, where you're getting a lot of complaints coming in.
Yes.
And then there will be individual complaints as well, presumably from individuals in certain areas. I assume that there must be, though, some level of noise that beyond which you start to get more complaints. So, you know, if people are experiencing 40 decibels, your heat map will be warmer or hotter. Is that not noticeable? Or do you get complaints of people where it's only 5 decibels?
We tend to get complaints of people 35 and above.
35 and above?
That's
Right.
just off the top of my head suggestion, but
Vibration.
I could quantify that and come back with the quantification.
But given you're receiving the complaints, there must be a sort of a rough
But I
figure.
mean, we are cognizant of the World Health Organization's threshold, and clearly when you do see the decibels, 3 decibels is a measure of power, so 3 dB is a doubling or halving of the power, depending on whether it's a positive or minus. The doubling of the volume is 10 decibels, but so when you are looking at 50 decibels and above, that's twice the volume that people would see as a reasonable threshold. So
But
hence why we started focusing on the areas
Right.
that were experiencing more than 50 decibels and so on, and then we tried to draw it down. My expectation was over time we would deal with enough of the issues raised and volume of track that we wouldn't receive as many complaints as we started developing solutions.
Okay, I'm not sure that answers Richard's question, but it would seem that there is a sort of...
We'll keep on going, I guess, is the...
There seems that there's a sort of informal threshold beyond which lots more people will start to complain. Jeanette?
Yeah, just to add to that, you know, over the time with the numerous public meetings I've held, it starts with 2 people who reach a point where, you know, they just need somebody to speak to, somebody to take over the complaint for them because they've lost it with TfL. And then what you then do is when you say to the neighbours and people locality, you then get a huge numbers of people. And then the experience I've had, and I'm sure you've had it, Andrew, and Joanne certainly had it, is when you then look to correlate the people in the room who have complained who have spoken to customer service, and it never matches TfL's data. So that's another thing that we have to look at. That people, it's almost like your multiple calls are only registered once. And I think there may be something in the system then that doesn't actually then trigger the enormity of the distress that individuals are caused.
There are two recording mechanisms. The first one is the customer call centre does record the number of complaints, regardless of how many times the people complain. If you complained every single day, it would go up by another one complaint. From a perspective of my engineering interventions, it is the same complaint with regards to it's the same property. So that's where the two numbers come from. But I can assure you that every complaint that is made to Transport for London is logged.
Duncan, what I would ask through the chair is that we be provided with your schedule, with the number of complaints, with the mitigations, with your, the expected time of intervention,
of course,
and that we can then post it on our line and make sure that everybody has that. And then I would ask you by the end of day that whatever information you have that you wanted to share based on individual cases, because you've only been able to really speak to Luca and Lisa, that you get that out post haste today, because you might have information you brought with you pertaining to other people that you're not able to share. And just to say that it's quite clear that there is an ongoing problem, and that in order to get to gain confidence from Londoners, from us as politicians doing this casework, we must have some sort of standard. I think it was Richard that says, it seems to me we're at the point where we must have a call for some sort of regulator or something. We're going to hear later on about aircraft noise, helicopter noise. I mean, it is just, London is just driving people out of it, I think, because of the level of noise nuisance. So, Chair, that's what I'd ask through you, that we be provided with, and to understand that this doesn't stop here today.
I think that would be extremely helpful if we are able to be provided with that. I mean, I think from today's session, I'm taking that there is still an issue in terms of the way in which TfL is responding, both to Assembly members who are picking up these issues, but actually much more important and much more particularly to the individuals who are reporting and experiencing these problems that are affecting people's health, not just their lives. So I think as TfL goes through, as you go through the process, particularly in relation to London Underground, with identifying what the problems are after you've received the initial complaints and looking in detail at the level of decibels, that we need to see a real improvement in terms of the customer contact. I mean, for those of us here who've worked or dealt with local authorities, housing associations and so on and so forth, keeping people updated during the course of a complaint that may have a complex solution is unbelievably important. And I don't want to speak on everybody's behalf, but because I'm wrapping up this session, in one sense, I do need to do that. I think keeping people informed as the problem is fully identified, as the solution is identified, as the timing of the solution being implemented is identified, it's absolutely critical to keep people updated throughout the whole of that process. And I do feel that we've heard, and we've also had a number of letters from people who aren't actually here bearing witness to this today, that does seem to still be an issue for TfL. So I certainly think that's one thing from today that we would want to see an improvement on. And certainly sharing where you've got your 90-day complaints, you've got your 90 to 180-day, and you've got things broken down into response periods. I think that would be really helpful for us to be able to, when we're dealing with people, to say, yes, you've been logged here, and this is what is happening. And I think also around the speed of solution, I think we've heard from a number of people. I think Richard has talked about been raising these issues for up to 20 years. I think that was probably the longest. I can see slightly sympathetic looks from some of the other guests looking towards Richard at this point. But I think the speed of solution is also really important here. And, you know, that might be something that we want to look at, whether or not additional resources need to be looked at, whether that's extra grinders or extra staff who are able to undertake these processes. I am going to, however, draw this part of today's session to a close. And can I really thank all of our guests who've come along and talked about their own experience and also spoken about other people's experience. And I would also like to particularly thank Duncan, who has taken the brunt of a lot of our questions very directly about what London Underground, TfL, are doing on these issues. I don't think it is going to stop here. I think we are going to be coming back to this and asking questions about, you know, when did the TfL board last look at this in detail? You know, are the solutions ones that can be broadened out from specific pilots more quickly to other areas? But thank you all very, very much for coming. We're going to take a very small break so that we can adjust the guest badging. So I'm just going to break the meeting now. Thank you all very much.
Unfortunately, I think that's probably the case.
We have done those in the
Good to see you. Taking your slow.
Yeah, well, not that you feel better.
second term.
Well, you don't have to tell us that.
As usual, Richmond has no complaints.
GLA, Chamber, Sound. 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 GLA, chamber, sound.
To recommence the March Environment Committee meeting with our second item on Heathrow. But just before I do that, if I could just conclude the previous item on tube noise by asking members if they are happy to delegate authority to me as the chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree specific outputs from the session on tube noise. Is that agreed?
No, Chair, can I make an intervention? One of the proposals is that we look to actually bring in the whole Assembly in on this in perhaps a motion of some sort. I think that we have to be taking this to the highest level possible and taking it to the Assembly, bringing in request for the board of TfL and the Mayor for action. That I think that we've heard enough here this morning
Is
to
that
be going
agreed?
to that level.
Is that
of
additional
action.
proposal agreed by the committee?
Yes, yeah, they're nodding.
Okay, I am seeing nodding. Right, okay, that concludes item 5 on our agenda, which now brings us on to item 6, which is on Heathrow Airport expansion. And I'm very pleased to be able to welcome our range of guests who've now joined us. We have Matt Gorman, who is the Director of Sustainability and Environment for Heathrow Airport. You're very welcome. We also have Andrew Chen, who is the Emissions Strategy Manager at Heathrow Airport. We also have Simon Burkett, who's the Founder and Director of Clean Air London. We have Jenny Bates, who is the Air Pollution Campaigner lead for London for Friends of the Earth, or nationally for Friends of the Earth?
Are they all on automatically?
They are all
on. I'm one of the air pollution campaigners at Friends of the Earth, the sort of policy lead.
Thank you.
I used to be in London. I used to cover London for us and cover all aspects of aviation.
The whole aviation issue. And then finally we have John Stewart, who is with us from HACAN, which is the Heathrow Association for the Control of Aircraft Noise. So we have a series of guests who hopefully should be able to provide us with a fairly illuminating and interactive discussion. I'm going to turn first to Tony Arbour, who is the member for the South West Assembly seat, which includes a number of boroughs that are rather close to Heathrow in the southwest of London.
We do. I'd like to ask a couple of questions initially, please, from you, Mr. Gorman. I have a sort of overall brief about the main elements of Heathrow's expansion proposal. Tell me, do you anticipate that at the conclusion of this consultation that you're going to get the go-ahead for the third runway?
Sorry, just to confirm, by the consultation you're referring to the government's national policy?
Yes, the whole consultation process.
So it's worth just reminding us briefly where we are in the process. So the government set up an airports commission which studied the issues for 3 years and recommended Heathrow. The government needs to translate that recommendation into a policy through the National Policy Statement consultation, which it's currently doing. Yes. We think that the Airports Commission made a very clear recommendation for Heathrow. The government has accepted that in principle and is going through the consultation. So I think we would certainly hope that at the end of this consultation that when it's put to Parliament, that Parliament votes to support a third runway, yes.
Is that hope or expectation?
I chose the word deliberately. We would hope that at the end of this process, Parliament votes.
It's fair to say, isn't it, that you're putting a lot of effort, a lot of resource into making plans for when the proposal is agreed? Isn't
yes.
It? So, in effect, it's expectation rather than hope.
Well, I would go back to the process we've gone through, a 3-year, £20 million independent study by the Airports Commission, a clear recommendation that Heathrow offers significant benefits for London and the UK and that the impacts can be addressed. Heathrow can be a better airport in part because it gets bigger, and the government has accepted that, so we are in principle, so we are moving forward on that basis.
All right. Now, these proposals, if they're accepted, impose quite a lot of conditions on Heathrow: noise, pollution, compensation, a vast range of things. Mm-hmm. Now, given that Heathrow currently, with the amount of aircraft movements that it accommodates, currently doesn't meet a great many of the restrictions which are imposed, viz. Pollution, how can you possibly expect to meet the conditions if there's going to be vastly more traffic at Heathrow, both from traffic seeking to access Heathrow and aircraft movements?
I'll answer on the traffic piece in a second, but if I can just push back on your characterisation that we don't meet, I think you said many of the restrictions currently in place. I'm not aware of any of the restrictions we don't currently meet, so it would be useful to understand those. On air quality in particular, air quality and air quality limits are not met in many parts of the UK, certainly in major cities. Ultimately, it's government responsibility to meet those. If you look at the area immediately around Heathrow, the monitoring stations do meet European limits. You have to travel 2 kilometres from Heathrow to the M4 before you find a site that doesn't meet a monitoring station that doesn't meet those limits, which I think is a clear illustration that the issue is primarily one of road traffic, which does bring us neatly on to your surface access point.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you. The simple noise measures you don't meet at Heathrow.
So we meet all of the relevant government restrictions out of the Terminal 5 inquiry, which is the most recent set of restrictions that were placed. And I think it's important to challenge that point because you threw it out there as a very broad characterisation, which I simply don't agree with.
Well, I do. I'm constantly pestered. Pestered isn't right because it's my job to reflect the views of my constituents. Who tell me, they complain about noise, they complain about night flights, they complain about traffic, they complain about pollution, and they say that the undertakings which have been given over the period of the inquiries, which I've lived through personally, have not been met, and there is a measure of incredulity that if you can't meet it now, how can you possibly meet the infinitely more stringent restrictions which are being proposed here? I wonder if I could ask perhaps Mr. Stewart whether or not he agrees with you that you aren't breaking any of the controls, the restrictions that currently operate at Heathrow. Is he correct?
He's probably correct that there's no legal restrictions that have probably been broken, but I think your point about looking forward is important because I think that there are a lot of pretty stringent conditions being placed on Heathrow that they've got to deliver. They've got to deliver a third runway with keeping within tight air pollution limits, tight noise limits. One of the conditions the government's put on is to say that there should be no extra airport-related traffic on the surrounding roads. Now, those may or may not be achievable, but it's certainly right to ask the questions of how they're going to be achieved.
Can I come back to you on that? Mr. Stewart has asked whether or not they are achievable. Many of the meetings that I've been at have rested on the fact that we will only know whether or not they are achievable after the event. Is that a proper way of deciding whether or not to go ahead with a project like this?
So I don't think that is the way it will be decided, but let me give a very brief overview because when we talk about the conditions, they, as you've outlined, they cover a huge range of issues: surface access, noise, air pollution, and a number of other areas. If I give a very headline summary and then talk about the role of independent regulation, I'm sure we'll come back to some of these issues. So, on noise, we have set out, and the Airports Commission has also concluded it's possible to grow Heathrow and reduce the number of people affected by noise, and that is our intent. On air pollution, we've set out how we can, from our work, believe we can expand Heathrow within health-based limits. The Airports Commission has concluded the same. A key part of that, linking to your surface access point, is our surface access strategies to ensure that there's no more airport-related traffic on the roads with expansion compared to today. So we put forward a series of goals that we had set. The Airports Commission concluded that they were deliverable but codified them in a set of conditions. And we accepted all of those conditions last year, and indeed, with the vast majority of them, also exceeded the conditions that the Commission had put on us. Now, I think going forward, I think there are, to your point on how can you be assured, I think there are 2 points. The first is that we are embarking on a 4-year, very detailed planning process. A bit of jargon I need to introduce, but it's important because we'll come back to it. We have to get, in order to construct a third runway, we have to get something called a development consent order. Now, this is the new planning process for nationally significant projects like Heathrow. It puts a very strong emphasis on upfront consultation on our plans, which we're embarking on from this summer. Those plans will be extensively consulted on, scrutinised by a planning inspector, so there will be a very detailed examination, and we would expect a series of planning conditions attached to any decision for Heathrow. We also think it's really important that there is independent regulation on both noise and air quality to hold us to account on what we've said in order that those issues are transparently regulated. We're really pleased that the government is planning to introduce an independent commissioner on noise. We think we should have the same on air quality.
You're getting a sort of a free run at this. I think that the thing which concerns us, and I think which concerns most Londoners who are going to be directly environmentally affected by this, is a belief that it is impossible. I mean, you know, if there's going to be 250,000 extra flights, common sense tells us that that's going to create noise, it's going to create pollution, and so on. And it's very difficult to believe. I think your original statement was something along the lines of, you know, there's going to be more, but it's going to be better. And there is an incredulity there. And clearly it's in your interest to say that it's achievable. I wonder if I can ask your other colleagues whether or not they think it's achievable. I've asked Mr. Stewart whether or not he thinks it's achievable. I wonder if I can ask your colleagues. Yes, you'd like to go first.
Thank you very much. If I can make just a point of disclosure, I've mentioned this to the committee before, previously giving evidence, but my late father-in-law was chairman of British Airways, and he and I both agreed that the air quality laws ought to be complied with around the airport, so we never actually argued on this subject.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Burkett.
If I can pick up a couple of points. The first is that Clean Air in London commissioned the McCracken opinion, a very eminent QC who looked at the role of the Air Quality Directive in the UK planning system. And one of the things that he specifically looked at was the proposed Heathrow expansion. And he commented in his opinion that the Airports Commission had misdirected itself in law in its conclusions. So I think that is a very important clarification. So it did not give a proper green light to expansion. The second thing is that airport nitrogen dioxide limit values are exceeded around the airport. Maybe they're 2 kilometres away, but in part, one of the reasons why they are exceeded is because of road traffic movements to the airport, to and from the airport. So I think that the airport does contribute to exceedances of the limit values currently.
Yes, I agree.
So I think I would say that. It's one of the other important things that McCracken said in his opinion was that airport expansion would be possible within air quality laws, provided that there is a robust plan in place to comply with the nitrogen dioxide limit values and other requirements, but the nitrogen dioxide limit values before approval for expansion was permitted. So the best way to achieve that, or the most practical example of that, is that if there was a robust plan in place to ban diesel vehicles for many miles around Heathrow, including the M4 and the M25, if that was in place, then my guess is it would be possible to expand the airport within the limit values.
Okay, thank you for that. That's a surprising answer. Ms. Bates, what do you think? Do you think they can do it?
Well,
I didn't say that they could do that. I said that that's what it would require. No. Yep.
Yeah, I don't want to cut you off in your prime, but we're slightly poaching into Caroline's line of questioning around air pollution. Perhaps if we move on to Caroline, and then if we take back any points that you feel that she hasn't covered.
Chair, could I just come back very quickly on one point, because it was kind of left hanging by Mr. Arbour. This idea of incredulity that we could achieve things. I just wanted to point back to two historical facts which give us confidence. Since the 1970s, at the beginning of the 1970s, the number of flights from Heathrow has doubled. The noise footprint area has fallen by 90%. So that gives us confidence we can do the same in future. Since the early 1990s, the number of passengers from Heathrow has increased by about 80%, but airport-related traffic has stayed about the same, as we've made significant reductions in colleagues travelling by car. So on both of those issues, we take confidence from the fact that we have done it before.
The argument that's all, I'm sorry, I must come back on that. Much easier to do it when you are increasing from a relatively small number to a larger number, but when you are increasing from a larger number to an even greater number, it's going to be much more difficult to achieve. Get that all the time, you know, from developers and people like that who come to us and say, yes, it's not going to have very much impact on the environment just putting up 200 units. Because maybe the schools and the infrastructure can cope with it. But when they then come back and want to extend it more, and you're in exactly the same boat.
I wouldn't describe the increase from 40 million to 80 million passengers since the early 1990s, which we have achieved without increasing cars on the road, as a small increase.
You understand the analogy that I'm drawing. It's much easier when you're working from a smaller number and increasing a smaller number to a larger number than from going up to a larger number to an increasing number. I'm sorry, Chairman. Let's go back to you.
Caroline's going to lead the questioning around air pollution issues, and we'll obviously bring in all of the guests. But I'm absolutely sure that Tony is going to want to come back in.
Okay, so yes, so focus now on air pollution, noise and climate change are going to be coming up with other questions afterwards. Now, you have, Matt, said that you think that the expansion can happen within health-based limits, and I just wonder if you could just expand a little bit more, both in terms of zonal compliance and also limit value compliance around the surrounding area and the approach roads.
So we've set out that our role as the airport is to play our part in meeting health-based limits. It's not solely within our gift, and this has been picked up by others talking about road traffic. Equally, we acknowledge that while 3/4 of the traffic on the M4 we don't think is related to the airport, about a quarter is, so we absolutely have a role to play. There are actions we can take within the airport fence, if you like, related to aircraft or airport vehicles, which will reduce emissions, but pollution disperses very quickly away from the airport. So the key issue is road transport. The role we can therefore play is to say that as a result of expansion, there'll be no more airport-related traffic on the road, and the key tool to achieve that is a transformation in rail connectivity to Heathrow. We're well connected into London. In future, we'll be well connected to the north through the Old Oak Common Link and HS2, to the west through Western Rail access, and to the south through Southern Rail access. So that allows us to deliver the goal of no more airport-related traffic on the road and half of our passengers coming by public transport in future. So that's what gives us confidence in saying we can expand within health-based limits.
And what about the Client Earth case where it was deemed that it was a mistake to think in terms of limits rather than just meeting limits wasn't good enough? You actually need to be thinking about reducing exposure.
Well, we agree, and we will absolutely be studying every tool that's available to us to reduce exposure. And are committed to doing that today. I'm happy to talk more about the steps we're taking today and absolutely committed to do that in future. I suppose the reference to limits is because we also operate within a legal framework currently which requires the UK as a whole to meet certain health-based limits that Europe has agreed. So I think that's an important reference point as well.
Do you think that if all the additional public transport links, I mean, you're very confident that that those are all going to appear. What if they're delayed or you don't, the anticipated passenger capacity just doesn't materialise? What's going to happen there? How can you do it?
Well, we are confident in those, and I can explore the individual schemes in more detail. And I think, but the reason we're confident is because of the recognition of the importance of better connecting Heathrow both into London and into the wider UK economy for the benefits that Heathrow brings. That gives us confidence. But I think we've also been absolutely clear. I come back to the point I made on independent regulation. We think that there should... Sorry, let me go back a step. We've said that we think that before capacity is released at Heathrow, there should be an independent assessment that confirms that doing so will not compromise meeting those air quality regulations. And we think that that should be delivered by an independent air quality regulator. So there's if you like, a guarantee on our ability to meet limits before capacity is released. And that, we think, is the most concrete proposal that we can make to address those concerns. It's something we're actively lobbying the government on.
Can I bring, first of all, Simon and then Jenny in on what we've heard so far?
I've just to clarify my point before. What I'm saying is I set out what would be required before any approval would be given for Heathrow. I'm not saying that I think it's at all likely or even possible that would happen in the next few months, that they'd ban diesel on the M4 and the M25, although it obviously would be a good idea for public health. When I last gave evidence to this committee about Heathrow expansion, there were a whole lot of challenges, many of which the committee has set out this morning. The position has gone backwards from the airport's perspective since I last gave evidence here with others. The High Court showed that, or concluded that the government's assumptions on its nitrogen dioxide modelling were flawed and has ordered DEFRA to produce a new plan. Unfortunately, that plan will not be published in draft until next month, so it'll be just a few weeks before the NPS consultation actually closes. So it's very hard to tell what will be in that new DEFRA plan. In February, the European Commission sent the UK a reasoned opinion, which is the second of 5 stages of infraction action. So that is separate to the Client Earth and High Court case. So these sort of things have gone backwards. And I think that it's also become clear that the surface access strategy, which is a sort of key condition, is that there's no clarity at all. It's become clear that there is no clarity on who will pay for it to achieve the sort of objectives which are needed. So I feel that the case for Heathrow, which didn't exist to start with, has become even weaker since we last met.
So, sorry, can I just go back to Matt there, just on the issue of who's paying for all this surface access, because that goes back to my question about what happens if it doesn't all materialise. So,
just before we do, can we just clarify, because Simon referred to it a couple of times there, that the last time when you were here and were discussing Heathrow was at our November meeting, which was when we just heard the announcement from the government. I had just come in prior to that. Sorry, Caroline, do go on.
Thank you.
But just for clarity.
Thank you.
yes, so, sorry, yes, so what about this, that surface access issue? It's not clear at the moment who's paying for it. So how can you be so confident that it's all going to materialise?
Well, I'll go through the specific schemes and explain why in a second, but let me make the overall point. We've been very clear throughout, and it remains our position, we will pay our fair share. And that's the...
How much?
Hold on, just because I know this is a topic of interest to the committee. Let me just finish there. It is government policy in the UK and around the world that airports contribute public transport improvements that are directly needed for the airport specifically, and they contribute the on-airport part typically of those. There is a role for national governments also to make a contribution, because typically these schemes have wider benefits as well. That's an established model. We have included already £1 billion for surface access improvements within our plan. let me just take, I talked about connectivity north, east, south and west. Let me start east into London. We already have Heathrow Express, Heathrow Connect. Crossrail is coming, funded, being delivered, will arrive at Heathrow in 2019. Piccadilly line upgrade planned as well. To the north, HS2 is going through its development process and will then connect through Old Oak Common. Western Rail access is being developed by Network Rail at the moment. It's going through its own planning process with a view to introducing it from 2024. The one question is Southern Rail access. Question in the sense that it's relatively early in the planning, but the initial work published by Network Rail at the end of last year showed a very strong business case for that, a very strong benefit-cost ratio. So again, it appears that there's a strong case, so which is why we have confidence, looking at each point of the compass, in being able to deliver.
So you said that you would pay your fair share. Mm-hmm. Can you unpack that a bit more? Because what I've heard, what we've heard in the past is that that's a very, very small amount of money in terms of the overall costs. Can you give us a percentage of what you're proposing that you're paying?
No, and it depends on the overall cost. There have been a wide range of costs quoted. The TfL figures of £15 billion, I believe, which we don't recognise. Actually, even going back, and I can find the reference for you, the then MD of Planning at TfL, Richard DeCanny, giving evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee, appeared to acknowledge in his statement that figure related to a whole host of schemes across London as a whole, not entirely linked to Heathrow expansion. So I think the government itself has said that it doesn't recognise those figures. The Airports Commission included a figure of £4 billion, but that included widening of the M4, which we don't think is necessary for Heathrow expansion. We don't think would be supported anyway by government policy, which brings us down to a much lower figure for the surface access improvements that are needed.
You still haven't given a figure.
No, and I won't, and I'm not going to give a figure here today. I've said that I've said what we've included in our cost plan already, £1 billion, and I've said there will be some ongoing negotiation, doubtless, over what exactly a fair share means, but I've pointed out that all of the schemes that I've mentioned have wider benefits beyond Heathrow, and it's accepted policy in the UK and around the world that airports pay their fair share.
Okay, can I bring Jenny in here?
Thank you. Yes, I think what we're hearing is that there is acknowledgement of the EU requirements, health-based limits, rightly so, and the fact that we're way over limits for NO2 and that the court has for a period of time been requiring limits to be brought down in the shortest possible time. But there are also EU requirements to maintain air where it's under limits. So it isn't just a question of bringing them down. And we're hearing various sort of thoughts of how little bits can help mitigate the planned increase and reduce some of the added problems. But the obvious thing is, the very simplest thing is just not to make anything worse at all. That there is nothing that could help health better than just not to add to it, because, for instance, we know that there are health effects below the EU legal limits of 40. The World Health Organization have found that. So, that is the elephant in a way. We're talking about tiny little bits of how to help things. The other big issue is that the Airports Commission and the government have always been relying on a policy test, not in the aviation national planning statement, but came from the National Networks one, which 513, if I recall correctly, which basically allowed a worsening of air over EU limits if elsewhere in the air quality zone, which for these purposes is London, would have even worse air, which basically is described as whether the scheme would be delaying compliance of the London air quality zone, and the assumption is that if somewhere else is even worse, that even if you add air pollution at Heathrow, that Heathrow new scheme wouldn't be the thing delaying compliance because somewhere else is even worse anyway. And that's always been relied on, and that's the McCracken opinion rebuts that Simon Burkett was talking about. And in fact, in the recent Client Earth 2 case that's referred to, the one that the opinion we had in last November, really re-clarifies the fact that that policy test is not acceptable. We cannot rely on that. And I would just read you a very short passage that is the relevant bit. And it says, this is in the conclusion, paragraph 95, small 1, that the Secretary of State must aim to achieve compliance by the soonest date possible, which is what we know, and then it goes on, that she must choose a route to that objective which reduces exposure as quickly as possible. So it's about actually reducing people's exposure. So that is the way that it is clear that we cannot allow any worsening, even if that worsening doesn't delay compliance. That the test for whether a scheme delays compliance is not adequate, because if you are worsening exposure, that is not acceptable. So that's something that has come since other documents. And I would just say, relevant to that is the updated air quality reanalysis from this February from the airport, which says in its 1.3 discussion that there is a risk that the options will delay or worsen compliance with limit values. So that sounds as if it would even fail that national networks test. But even if it didn't, then we shouldn't be relying on that test anyway. And Simon's also referred to the fact that we've got this new plan after the November ruling coming. And yes, that's going to require stronger action, but it's starting from a much worse position, assumptions on air, because the government hadn't sort of accurately modelled the position. They were too optimistic. So everything's going to be from a much worse starting point, even though they're now going to have to take action more quickly. So,
do you think that it is just that any increase in surface access transport emissions is going to is possible while not increasing exposure?
If you're asking, so I would say that if increased surface access from the scheme would worsen air where it was already over by any material amount, that shouldn't be allowed. And it shouldn't be allowed to be assumed that it was okay because of that national networks test, which seems to allow that. So I would say, yes, that shouldn't be acceptable for any material increase if air was over EU limits.
Yes. I've got John and Simon both indicating.
Just briefly on the surface access point, I think it's absolutely right, and I think Matt's right. The surface access and the new surface access schemes are critical to the air pollution. And if they're critical, then what becomes critical is how they're going to be paid for. Now, again, Matt is right that we shouldn't ask the airport. That wouldn't be good practice, wouldn't be accepted practice for the airport to pay for the entire show. They should pay for a proportion that is related to the airport, and particularly to the third runway. But it still leaves great uncertainty as to who is actually going to pay for the bulk of the surface access schemes. I think we were hoping that there would be clarity in the national policy statement, and there hasn't been. All that the national policy statement says is that the government will negotiate with Heathrow and other parties as to who will pay. And the figures, Davis has talked about 5 to 6 billion. As we heard, TfL have put it as high as possibly 15 billion. But whatever the figure is, it's going to run into billions. And unless we have absolute clarity as to who is going to pay those billions, we don't have any certainty at this point that the air pollution problem can be dealt with.
Thank you.
Could I just say that I seem to have spent all day saying this because I was saying it in the earlier session as well. We are starting to run out of time. So if I could just ask you, Caroline has got some further questions that she wants to ask about air pollution, and we do want to talk about noise and to get a full picture from you. So if I could just ask you to make your answers very snappy, that would be really helpful because then we can cover all the different areas.
Felt like we had only just started, but I will be brief.
Thank you. Sorry, Simon, you were...
I've got 2 points, which is then done my list. So I think that the first thing is that the NPS is actually very weak on air quality, what it says on air quality. But I think that what we should be looking at is much clearer conditions and preconditions on what is required. The McCracken tests I've mentioned, for example, already. Gatwick Airport, I would point you to a report by them where, for example, they set out a triple lock in relation to construction activity. So I will pass that to the Secretariat afterwards. And I would also suggest, by way of conditions, that what the Labour government did when they gave approval for an extra half a runway was they actually said that the Environment Agency would be given the responsibilities, the powers, they didn't say the resources, but that would clearly also be required to ensure that the legal requirements for air and I guess the health requirements were also met. And there were cartoons then about wheel clamping aeroplanes. So conditions, I think, preconditions ought to be much clearer. And then the final point I would make is that I think we're not getting the transparency around the airport about what is happening with the air quality trends. There was some work done by Professor Rod Jones, and I don't believe that that has actually been published yet, and it would be very helpful to see that, which was referred to by the BBC. I think they drew conclusions which perhaps they shouldn't have done. But the other point is that Heathrow used to be publishing quarterly sort of trends for monitors around the airport, and I think has stopped doing that.
I'd like to.
Maybe,
I'll just pick that up because that is my responsibility, and that is actually inaccurate. So we do host and publish that information publicly on a quarterly basis. You can go to heathrowairwatch.org.uk, find all of that information, including 15-minute real-time data from the 22 monitoring sites within Heathrow's own funded network, as well as the 4 local authorities that we support and host that data on their behalf online.
I think that
Thanks, Andrew,
at least
helpful.
one of those monitors, I believe, has been getting worse. So I think it would be good to actually look at those. So perhaps you can clarify which ones have been getting better and which have been getting worse. Thank you.
We're happy to share that report.
I mean, can you just broadly, can you say some of the monitors are showing worse pollution now?
So 2015, or excuse me, 2016 in general across London saw worsening at almost all stations throughout. I've not compared the increases around Heathrow specifically and the Heathrow monitoring network, as well as the monitoring networks in Hillingdon, Hounslow, Slough, and Spelthorne to those throughout central London. But it's safe to assume that the levels of increases that have been experienced are similar to those throughout central London, if not less.
So if these levels are worsening,
so I think,
how do you think how are you able to underpin your case that you can have this increase in surface transport emissions?
What the situation with air quality levels and annual average NO2 levels points to are that the things that we can control as an airport are our emissions, and we have seen drastic reductions over the last several years in our emissions. So from the most recent 5-year period of our full emission inventories, we've seen a 16% reduction in ground-based nitrogen oxides between 2009 and 2013. We continue to see great emission reductions from ground-based sources. When you think about the air quality picture and the actual concentration levels, you have to bring in not just the emissions from local sources, but climatic conditions, atmospheric conditions, as well as background concentration levels. So what we can focus on and what we are confident in our ability to reduce are our emissions, as well as the working with local partners, as I mentioned, the London boroughs of Hounslow and Hillingdon, as well as the local authorities and councils in Slough and Spelthorne, as well as the collaboration that we've got with TfL and the Mayor of London. I know we're coming to a close here, but I should mention it is Hydrogen Week. Yesterday, Heathrow, as part of our Clean Vehicle Partnership, hosted a hydrogen vehicle showcase in partnership with Hydrogen London, which is chaired by the Deputy Mayor for Environment. So we're doing great work in collaboration with our partners. We're continuing to reduce emissions, and ultimately, we have no control over atmospheric conditions, but we can continue to work in partnership to reduce those emissions.
Yeah, but I mean, it's great, hydrogen buses, you know, marvellous to be bringing emissions down. But what we're talking about here is a situation in London where pollution levels are going up, and where you are talking about introducing a whole load of extra surface transport with all the associated emissions.
We're not, that's the key point. The strategy is no more airport-related traffic on the road. Sorry, I can't have been clear on that earlier. That's the point. We're not introducing more.
But how do you have no more traffic when you are expanding the airport? You will therefore need more people to get there to work. You will, you're going to have more passengers trying to get there. How does that square that there is no more surface access transport?
So transformation in rail links, north, east, south and west, more people coming by public transport, 50% of people coming by public transport by 2030. And I come back to the point I made, we've done it before. We went from 40 million passengers in the early 1990s to about 80 million today, and the number of the airport-related traffic level has remained broadly the same. And that's because of historic public transport investment. It's the same moving forward.
And I just need to follow up the point on trends. So while Greater London, the UK, has seen an increase in levels between 2015 and 2016, if you look over time, it's a generally decreasing trend. So you can't just look at that 1 year-on-year increase as indicative over the last 10 years. So you do see a decreasing trend. That trend is evident around Heathrow as well as in the UK.
So can the commitment to no increase in surface transport coming to the airport, is that binding in any way, or is that just a goal for yourselves?
We've set it as a clear goal for ourselves, and as I say, as we go through the planning process, we would expect the planning process to consider that and look at it in the appropriate way. But we've been absolutely clear that, you know, our goal is to not add extra traffic to the road, partly for air pollution reasons, partly as well for congestion reasons in the local area. And we've set out very clearly over a number of years our strategy to deliver that.
Thank you, Chair. So how does that fit with this February updated air quality reanalysis, which at 1.33 says that alongside roads remote from the airport where a small increase in emissions due to the option is combined with the blah, blah, blah. And then it goes on to say this is typical of the impacts of the Heathrow NWR, Northwestern Runway. So that clearly implies there is going to be an effect from the scheme, even remote from the airport, for that option.
Do you want to respond to that?
So I go back to what I said at the beginning. The Airports Commission concluded very clearly you can expand Heathrow within health-based limits. Our work supports the same conclusion as does the government.
We've just been hearing that it can't because you're stuck with this business of exposure. Simon, did you want to?
You know, the McCracken opinion made very clear that the Airports Commission had misdirected itself in law, because what it was saying was, as Jenny had said, and I'll try and summarise very quickly, is that you could do what you wanted, worsening locally, provided it was worse still somewhere in Marylebone Road or something like that. And McCracken just basically ridiculed that idea. You actually have to comply with the limit values locally, as well as report as a zone separately to Brussels once a year. So there are two separate things. One is sort of domestic law about complying with limit values locally, and the other is about reporting zone compliance through to Brussels once a year. They're different things.
And just to wrap up on that, I mean, we don't define the legal tests that we need to meet. But we are absolutely committed to playing our part in meeting health-based limits, reducing exposure as much as possible, as quickly as possible, exploring every option to do that. And I've talked of some of the ways that we can do that. But critically, we think, and there may be some common ground actually with Simon on this, we equally have advocated the Environment Agency having the role of an independent regulator on air quality. We think that's the right answer to provide the right level of scrutiny and to hold us to account on playing our proper role.
Just finally, what would that holding you to account look like? Because just say the runway goes ahead, say it worsens local air quality or delays London complying with its zonal commitments, what would happen?
Well, I go back to what I said earlier. We've said that we think capacity should only be released once it can be demonstrated that that can be done while meeting the relevant air quality regulations. And Simon's absolutely right. Close to 10 years ago now, when the Labour government supported R3, they said the Environment Agency should consider all the issues and effectively decide whether and how much capacity should be released in order to meet air quality limits. And we're saying we think we have a very solid plan to achieve that, but we understand that people will want independent scrutiny of that. We think the Environment Agency should be doing that.
Does anyone else want to comment on the Environment Agency applying that scrutiny?
Well, I think the only thing I would add to that is that the McCracken opinion is since that Environment Agency mechanism, and McCracken is very clear that you need to have not just an independent person, police person or whatever. You also need to have a robust plan in place to comply with the limit values before you give approval to any expansion at Heathrow. So, that's a separate thing. What we were talking about before are sort of additional conditions on top of that.
So is that the government applying that? The condition about the limit complying, the plan to comply?
To the government, before the government can approve a plan for a Heathrow expansion, it must have, by law, a plan in place to achieve the limit, a robust plan in place to achieve the limit values. And that's not just at one point in London, that's everywhere where the limit values apply.
But supposing it does have that negative impact, Matt and possibly Andrew as well, do you have contingency plans that you worked through in case the additional number of aircraft and the additional number of passengers, that you're not able to keep air quality either where it is now or preferably better? And does that have some kind of impact on your business case that's been put forward at the moment?
Well, so you won't be surprised that this is an issue that we've studied in a lot of detail because it is a very material issue for the airport in future. We are, and as a result of all the work that we've done, we are confident in the plans that we've put forward and in being able to operate and meet the air quality regulations that we need to. I think the one thing I've kind of lifted up to a bit, I guess, is just looking at the pace of change that we're beginning to see, and air pollution is rightly a big focus at the moment. But I think the amount of attention being devoted by the mayor, by central government, actually around the world on this issue, our view is that we're at the beginning, certainly in relation to surface transport, of a period of quite rapid development of new technologies. I think TfL, or the GLA itself, has produced an estimate for London that potentially by 2030, 60% of new vehicles sold are either electric or plug-in hybrid. That's a transformation from where we are today. And the big issue is road transport, not aircraft, as we've said before, because of how pollution disperses very quickly. So we are confident in our plans moving forward. I can only reiterate that point.
Okay, I'm now going to move on then from the air quality issues, which you're saying you're confident in, and we're looking at this transformational change, over to noise. And David is going to lead the questioning on the noise issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On noise pollution and the issues around that, it can be devastating to people who live near an area where there's a lot of noise pollution, in terms of health and also in terms of education, which sometimes people forget, and the effect on lessons on schools. Now, the figure from the Airports Commission that I have says 700,000 people are affected currently, and the figure I have from TfL and their study suggests that another 200,000 additional people will be affected by noise when the third runway is built. But there's another figure. The government maintains that the number of people affected by noise from Heathrow will be less in 2030 than today. Now, there seems to be a contradiction there. So I'll ask the gentleman from Heathrow first, Matt, perhaps. How will aircraft noise and noise from Heathrow reduce? How is that possible while the airport expands and flights increase?
I'll explain that briefly, and I'll make a quick comment at the end just on the different bits of data. I come back to the point I made at the beginning. Compare the early 1970s to today, the noise footprint around Heathrow has fallen by 90%, even as flights have doubled. And the package of measures that's delivered that will allow us to do the same in future, grow the airport, reduce noise. Planes are getting quieter. Heathrow attracts more of those quieter planes than any other airport. We have more of the next generation aircraft, 787s and A350s, than our three closest European hub airports combined. So we attract a disproportionate amount of quiet aircraft. So quiet planes. Secondly, flying those aircraft more quietly. There's a whole host of procedures we already use. In future, we'll be looking at things like steeper approaches into the airport, so aircraft are higher. And finally, operating restrictions. We have the strictest restrictions of the other major European airports for night flights today, and we've said in future that we think the period without night flights should be extended. So that's how we are confident that we can grow the airport and reduce noise. Actually, of all the studies in this area, the TfL one is the only one that predicts an increase in future, and that's because it assumes that Heathrow operates in exactly the same way as today, with the same aircraft types as today into the future. So it's deliberately a very worst case scenario. The Airports Commission, ourselves, the government have all concluded it's possible to grow Heathrow and reduce the number of people.
Well, the figure they give is 2030, but the runway will fill up with capacity. It will grow in the number of aircraft being used and the number of passengers from 2030 onwards up to 2040 and 2050, won't it? So, I mean, you can't deny, can you, that there will be extra people affected by the Northwest runway, the third runway, that aren't affected now. Is that correct?
No, that is correct, and we have been completely open on that throughout. The figures we've been talking about, and the figure you mentioned, is the overall number of people within the noise footprint, which shrinks. Inevitably, when you build a new runway, you need a flight path in order to land aircraft, and there will be some people close to that runway under a flight path that aren't under a flight path today. But that's significantly offset by the number of people who come out of the noise contour, who see less noise in future.
So there'll be people, you're saying that there'll be fewer people affected by the existing two runways, perhaps by steeper flights and so on?
Fewer people affected overall, yes, but close to the new runway, there will be a new flight path to allow planes to take off.
How can you be confident that that decrease in noise will actually occur? You say that there will be newer generations of aircraft. I mean, how can you be certain that will take place by 2050?
So we're already seeing that new generation of aircraft coming in at Heathrow, and as I say, we attract more of them. Airlines want to put their cleanest, quietest aircraft on Heathrow routes because they're the newest aircraft, and Heathrow routes are premium routes. So we've said by the time the third runway opens, we think 90% of those aircraft will be next generation aircraft types. We use our landing charges to incentivise the quietest aircraft. So to land one of the noisiest aircraft would cost you £9,000, one of the quietest £600. So we send a very clear incentive to encourage the quietest aircraft.
How many, you say 90% in 2030, how many are now? What's the figure now? Of that
it's significant. I need to check. I don't have that off the top of my head.
But
we have, that's based on a whole host of projections of fleet deployment that we've worked with airlines, with industry colleagues on. So we are confident in those figures because we're beginning to see that change now. We know 787s, A350s, A380s are being sold now, and airlines are increasingly buying them to use at Heathrow. The other big change is the next generation of short-haul aircraft. All the other types I've mentioned are bigger long-haul aircraft, which we expect to be coming in as well. Okay. I can provide the committee with further detail on that. We've published a huge amount on that.
We need that figure sort of now to compare the two.
No, very happy.
I'll bring in John now. But what do you have to say? How do you see the effects of going forward?
Yeah, I mean, we welcome things obviously like quieter aircraft, improved operational practices and so on. No question about that. We have a difficulty with Matt's statement that things have got quieter dramatically since the 1970s. It all depends what metrics you're using, how you're actually measuring the noise. When you average out the noise, there's too much weight, in our view, given to the noise of individual aircraft, which have reduced dramatically over the last 20, 30 years, and not enough weight in the calculations to the number of aircraft which have increased dramatically over the last years. Now, because of that, it distorts how people are actually on the ground are hearing the noise. Because what's happened since the 1970s, while the noise contours measured in that way have gone down, the number of complaints have soared. And the number of complaints have soared because what's critical to people are the number of planes going over their heads. And that's gone up. And our concern with the third runway, even with quieter planes and everything else which we welcome, is that if the number of planes going over people's heads are increasing, then actually, as far as that local person is concerned, as far as that community is concerned, things are getting worse. Now, there may be ways, and we may be coming to this later on, of using respite and so on to partially deal with this. But at the moment, if you're going to have an increase of 250,000 planes a year coming into Heathrow, that means that for many communities, perhaps not all, but for many communities, there's going to be more planes coming over their heads each day. And even if some of those planes, a lot of those planes are marginally quieter, that is going to be a worse noise climate. And that's our big concern.
So you're saying it's more that the issue is it's continuous rather than
the issue,
almost.
That's right. The issue is not the averaging out of the noise. I understand why it's done, but that's not how people hear noise. The issue is the number of planes, the virtual continuous noise overhead. And with 250,000 more planes, as things stand right now, and without respite, then we're going to get communities with more planes going over their head, not just in West London, but right across South East London, right across North East London as well. And that's our concern, and that's our big concern about the impact of the third runway.
If I can just pick up on that, we're concerned about that as well. And actually, this is an area we've engaged with John over a number of years on now. So I've talked about the overall reduction in an average noise footprint, and that's an important measure of aircraft getting quieter, but it's definitely not the only measure, because I agree with much of what John's just said, actually. We are also committed to look at providing predictable respite. This is what we hear from people across London in terms of concerns about noise, is give us periods with noise and without noise. Now, if you live in West London, you benefit from the fact that we switch between our two runways halfway through the day, but across other parts of London, you don't. The opportunity we have in future is that airspace across the UK and Europe is being redesigned. We can use new technology, we think, to provide multiple flight paths and then alternate between those. Now, that will all need to be consulted on. We need people's views on how best to use this new technology. But we think there's a real opportunity to design airspace with a third runway to provide better respite than we do today.
From our point of view, that would be utterly critical if a third runway ever goes ahead. That meaningful respite is brought in, not just for West London, but for all areas affected, so that so the situation does not arise where 250,000 more planes means more planes over communities. Respite is absolutely central and critical to this, and as I say, right across London, it will require a lot of creative thinking and bold thinking by not just Heathrow, but by organisations like the CAA and Air Traffic Control, which have flown planes in a certain way for decades. But we remain opposed to a third runway because of particularly the noise impact. But if it goes ahead, it would be a central condition that this respite is introduced right across the whole of London and the home counties.
Pretty sure we're going to come back to this discussion again, so I'm just going to say, David, that it's about 1:45. We will need to vacate this room by 1 o'clock for sure at the absolute latest, preferably slightly earlier, and I know that Simon has to definitely leave by 1 o'clock. So if we can just keep going with the questioning and keep the answers snappy. Thank you.
Night flights. How will you manage night flights? Is there a third runway?
So The Airports Commission recommended that there is a 6.5 hour period without night flights. Their recommendation was 11:30 to 6 in the morning. We agreed that there should be 6.5 hours without night flights. We proposed a slightly different time from 11 p.m. to 5:30, so half an hour earlier in the evening, half an hour earlier in the morning, because some of those early morning arrivals, the timing is very critical, and I can explain that a bit more. But that is a significant change, the first significant change in decades to early morning arrivals at Heathrow. So where the first plane currently flies across London to land at any time after 4:30 in the morning, that would be an hour later after 5:30. In terms of management of that, actually the night flight restrictions at Heathrow are actually a matter of national government policy, consulted on by the government, implemented by the government. So that would be ultimately a government decision, but we support that 6.5 hour period.
Okay, can I comment on that?
But even somebody as old as me needs more than 6.5 hours sleep a night. And in a very short answer, we would say, it's a step, but it's a small step in the right direction. But we really are looking at an 8-hour night as the norm, and that's what's recommended by the World Health Organization.
What would be your ideal?
Well, I mean,
time
ideally
frame
would be
for 8
11
hours?
till 7. I say it as the norm because I think the hour between 6 and 7 is a very busy hour, and it would be maybe realistically quite difficult to ban all flights at that time. But if you could move some of the flights that currently land between 6 and 7 just beyond 7, then you could reduce the number of flights between 6 and 7, maybe having them all landing on one runway for one particular week, so that certainly for most of the year, people could get an 8-hour night, and maybe the other weeks they would get a 7-hour night.
Thanks. I'm aware of the time, so I'll just go to the next question. But what about compensation for noise impacts? What are you going to do to compensate people who are going to be affected by a third runway if it happens?
So we've proposed, and the Airports Commission again has said that we should be held to account on a noise insulation scheme that extends to the entire noise footprint that we were talking about earlier. That's the European standard noise footprint. 55 LDEN in the jargon. That's about 160,000 homes in future. We've said that we'll provide the full cost of insulation in an inner zone close to the airport, £3,000 towards insulation in the outer zone. That's comparable with schemes offered by other big airports in Europe. We've described that as a world-class insulation package, which our current estimate would cost us around £700 million. That's a very significantly bigger scheme than we offer today.
The data I have, that 700 million will be in phases over 20 years, so that's quite a long time frame. Some people, might not get that until 2050.
Well, we will have to consult in more detail on the phasing of the scheme, and we absolutely anticipate beginning it before the runway opens. I think that kind of timeline is not that different from some of the other big European airports, but I take the point it could be a long time, and that's absolutely something we'll need to look at. So.
Some people who are affected would have to live with, an extra noise for 15, 20 years.
Under the current proposal, as I say, that's something we will absolutely be consulting on. It is comparable with other big airports around the world, but we will absolutely be looking at that.
Maybe, why can't you do better?
Well, we will. I can't say any more than we will be looking at it, which I've said
Matt,
several times.
That's quite a difference in time span between 15 or up to 30 years. Would you?
Yeah, I don't know where the 30 came from.
Could you confirm to us, perhaps after this session, what that phasing would be? Because you said you're working on that, and to let us know whether.
Well, so the current various numbers were bandied around by committee members. Our current proposal is a 20-year period.
20.
And I have acknowledged that is something that is comparable with other big European airports. But I take the challenge that it is potentially a long period, and it's something we'll need to look at.
And would there be some form of compensation for people who are living with, what might be deemed to be excessive noise for the whole of that 20-year period, and they're only having the insulation put in at the end?
So at the moment, our compensation offer focuses on the insulation, so it's actually tackling the noise issue. We haven't looked at other alternatives, but I think the key issue for us is what's the phasing of delivering that scheme, which is something we'll continue to look at. So.
But just, John, any quick final comments on
The quick final comment is I certainly want something that doesn't last, that I don't have to wait 20 years.
Okay.
No, I don't think anyone wants to wait. And I think we've agreed that the ideal noise regulator might look like the Environment Agency, having some sort of formal role.
or the new independent noise authority.
The new independent.
Yeah, I mean, Heathrow and ourselves are actually both quite supportive of this.
And would you envisage that authority having any kind of role around compensation as well?
It might do. I think it needs to be thought through fairly carefully, but it is a possible role for it, yes.
I certainly think representing Merton and Wandsworth, and I'm quite sure that Tony Arbour, who represents the South West, including Richmond, and of course Kingston, that the arrangements for compensation for people who are waiting towards the end of the 20 years for the world-class programme of insulation works would be of great interest to us and many of our constituents, in my case, particularly in Putney. I'm actually going to draw this session to... sorry, Tony, did you want to come in? I am going to bring you in.
Sorry? The question on carbon emissions.
I'm
We
going
can't
to-
talk about Heathrow
No,
without carbon emissions.
I'm going to mention that in a minute.
Yeah,
Tony.
very briefly, and if I may say so, Mr. Gorman, you very robustly, as you've always done, defended expansion, but of course for it to work, so many impossible things have to happen. For example, the Piccadilly line, even with the expansion, has got to cope. HS2 has got to come. All of the other environmental improvements have got to come. That's to do with the physical environment, the infrastructure. It seems very unlikely. Just on that last point, you talk about comparable airports. As far as compensation are concerned, hard put to think of another airport which has had to compensate 160,000 other households. One wonders how it would affect the building industry, for example, if they were able to do all the work that you say that you think can be done. But I think what's more importantly for us as a committee is that the GLA, both the Assembly and the Mayor, are opposed to this expansion. We think that it's wrong. The whole tenor of the discussion from all of you sitting there, alas, even including Mr. Stewart, seems to think that the thing is inevitable. I would like to suggest that there isn't any inevitability about this. And I would very much like us to, as a result of this meeting, at the end of any recommendations that you come up with, to say that the Mayor should actually begin to take a lead on this. We have the 3 London boroughs and Windsor and Maidenhead. How much better it would be if the Mayor actually led this. He put his money where his mouth is. He told us that he's going to put the resources of TfL, technical resources, TfL, into arguing against this proposal. Maybe we should ask for more than that, and that he should be the figurehead to lead this.
Tony, I'm going to stop you there because that's
okay,
not
well, I've made my point.
I don't think that's a question, unfortunately, that any of our guests can specifically answer.
No, but it's one for you
it's
to
one
decide.
for us as the Assembly, and it's one for us perhaps to put to the
Just
Mayor.
to say, Chair, we don't see it as inevitable at all.
Can I just say that we've got 3 minutes to 1 and we do need to leave the room, so I can't take any more contributions. As Caroline has just pointed out, I do have a series of questions that I wanted to put to you around carbon emissions, and so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to send those questions to all 5 of you, and it would be extremely helpful if you could let me have your responses as quickly as possible so that we can then include those hopefully at the end of the transcript. So I'd just like to ask the committee, that was item 6, if you're happy to note the report that we received in advance and the discussion that we've just held, and delegate authority to me in conjunction and consultation with party group lead members to agree any response to the government consultation, which we will be putting in by the 25th of May closing date, on the draft Airports National Policy Statement, if that's agreed. Good. If that's agreed, item 7 is our Environment Committee work programme, which is sets out in detail what we'll be doing up until September. That's pages 55 to 58. Is that noted? Noted. And could I just mention that our next meeting will not be in April, and at the moment we have a provisional date of the 24th of May, but that's subject to being ratified at the annual meeting of the Assembly on the 3rd of May. Is everyone happy to note that that is the date of the next meeting?
Noted.
I do not consider that there's any other business that is urgent. There is just one item I would draw attention to, which is that I have received a 5-page response from the Mayor to our letter to him about his environmental priorities. It is 5 pages, it's very detailed. We'll be circulating that to everybody after the close of the meeting, which I am now going to declare at an end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
GLA, Chamber, Sound. GLA, Chamber.